Ash was an 8-year-old kid, growing up in a tiny village where every day felt like it could explode into adventure. One day, he sprinted to Father Folk's house, too. He swallowed his nerves and asked if he could borrow a book, while Folk, still dozing in his seat, sat surrounded by a mountain of stories. Shot awake to the sound of Ash calling out. He shot a question at Ash. "So you're David's son?" And Ash nodded back, confirming it was true. Folka leaned in and asked what Ash wanted, and Ash blurted out that he just wanted to read a book. Folka flicked his eyes over the mess of scattered books and realized they'd gone filthy from being left untouched for too long. Then he leaned in and demanded to know what Ash planned to do next after devouring a book like that. Ash said he only read for pure fun, and when Folka looked baffled and asked what he meant, Ash launched into the explanation. With a world this cruel, reading became their lifeline and escape hatch that kept their sanity from snapping. Ash launched into what happened the day before, when the village chief's wife pulled the kids in and invited them to a reading session. Right then, Ash finally understood why diving into books calmed his racing heart, and in that cold, empty, unforgiving village, he swore reading was the one thing they couldn't live without. Even though Folka agreed to lend him the book, he leaned in and asked if Ash could actually read it. Ash admitted he couldn't do it, then begged Folka to teach him how to read and write. He insisted that teaching others was a priest's calling. And then he made his move, begging to be Folka's first student, especially since Folka had just been sent to their village straight from the royal capital. In the end, Folka flat out refused to teach him how to read and write. Ash then shot a quick request. Can he borrow an easy book? Folka stared at the book and wondered if Ash really grasped what books were worth, or if one wrong move from him meant he'd ruin it or sell it off. Ash promised he'd handle it with kid gloves, but he still argued that books are bound to wear down with time. Folka admitted it hit the nail on the head, but then she warned that even books won't last forever. They'll fade, break down, and rot. Ash shot a question: how long would it take to smash through every single book in the Folka's collection? He said if books are doomed to rot just because nobody reads them, then maybe it's better they get worn out through use than sit there untouched and die anyway. Folk realized Ash could charm anyone with his words then. Ash blurted out, "Can I borrow the books? I'll memorize the letters myself." Folk shot him down fast, saying it just wasn't possible to remember them that easily. Ash made it crystal clear he didn't think memorizing those letters by himself was going to be easy. Folk insisted, yep, it would be tough. But Ash didn't back down, saying he'd never said it wouldn't be. Then Ash asked, straight up, to borrow the scriptures Folk read during festivals, or a thick textbook of summaries, or even some holy sermons in book form, and Folka agreed at once, then thrust Ash a manuscript he'd written himself. Folka reassured him, if the manuscript got damaged, it wouldn't matter, and Ash thanked him, then pored over the manuscript with sharp, careful eyes. Then he leaned in and demanded that Folka teach him how to read that one sentence, and Folka shot back, reminding him that he'd already promised he'd memorize it himself. But Ash swore he planned to do it. No hesitation, and Folka shot back with a fierce request, calling on the wolf god, the monkey god, and the dragon god to bless the day with their full power. He halted right after that, and Ash blurted out, "Those are the holy words I know." Folk nodded and admitted he taught Ash the line, then told him he was free to go. Ash thanked him one more time and hurried out of the house. As he strode away, he felt this was the first real step toward finding joy again in his life. He stared into his own past and dug up his origins in Nazgul, a village this far off, rural speck of a place then. The old memories hit him in broken flashes, like they were trying to claw their way back. Those memories had faded into a blurry haze, so badly that he couldn't even remember what kind of person he used to be. But there's one thing we can count on. This life of his was a non-stop nightmare nothing, and it worked, and it was way worse than his old one. In this world, combustion engines didn't exist, and the village was so short on power and even basic fertilizer and workhorses that everything felt like it was on the brink. Every day, the villagers were dragged into non-stop labor just to stay alive. Then there was Ash, only 8 years old, yet already tough enough to handle the work. Everything from his old life felt like it happened in a dream far away and unreal. He realized the second he quit working, hunger would crush him still somehow. This new world made survival feel strangely entertaining, yet brutally demanding until, in the middle of his desperation, Ash suddenly felt like he'd stumbled onto the one thing that could actually entertain him. He finally got it. If he wanted to savor every page in his books, he had to learn to read at full speed. After bowing to his parents, he burst inside and started drilling the words Folk had taught him, struggling at first to split the sentences apart, but catching his breath when he realized the phonetic alphabet made every sound click as he kept going to the next page. And after all that reading, his eyes finally gave out. He drifted off and fell asleep. Later, his mother scooped him up and tucked him into bed, murmuring that Ash had been locked in on letters all day. So hungry to learn it was practically written all over him. Ash's father pushed her to tell him that books were pointless and that a man's job was tending the fields. But her mother snapped back that farming mattered yet reading was power too. She couldn't help but beam at the idea of Ash actually enjoying himself, savoring every page in the future. After that, Ash zipped back to Folka and begged to borrow another book. Folka leaned in and asked if Ash was already getting bored. Ash grinned and said he'd only need a month to memorize every last letter. Folka couldn't believe it. He swore it was impossible to master those letters in such a short time. Ash snapped back, saying he'd already mastered them, then pushed for a fresh book because he needed more. Folka wasn't buying it for a second, and she snapped at Ash to come up with a lie that actually sounded real. Ash, fed up, demanded to know what Folka would say if he somehow managed to memorize every single letter, and Folka snapped back that that was wildly unlikely then. Ash pushed the idea even further. If he could actually remember every last letter, then under Folka's watch, he should be allowed to borrow any book he wants. Mocha agreed to the deal, but she made Ash prove himself first by showing her he'd memorized the letters. Ash then leaned in and demanded to know how to prove it right there, so he grabbed a pen and paper, and Folka shot back. "So what are you planning to do with those?" Ash shot back that he was ready to hammer out a contract. He dropped the fact that Folka would hand him a book as payback for calling him a liar. Then he demanded, straight up, if Folka thought that was really a smart move. Folka demanded to know why Ash wanted to push it so far. Then Ash snapped that her book refusal was fair, but getting called a liar meant she owed him an apology, because it tore up his heart, and he even played the part, acting furious and faking tears. Folka stared in disbelief, saying Ash didn't look hurt one bit then. Still shoved the pen and paper into his hands. Ash took the paper and snatched the quill like it was a lightning strike, grumbling that he wasn't used to writing with one, and that his handwriting was plain and simple, awful. As soon as Folka finished the contract, he snatched the paper and froze in shock. Ash had actually memorized every single letter in just 1 month. He leaned in and demanded how Ash pulled off that insane feat, because Ash still couldn't read worth a damn before this. Ash told him he locked onto the very first sentence, then used its letters like a key to crack everything that came after, filling in the unknown characters as he went. He was so convinced this proof crushed his claim. For his next book, Ash demanded either a religious text or a storybook, so easy to read it practically begged to be opened. He hauled the books home, where his mom backed his reading obsession, even as his dad barked at him for it. Still, Ash threw himself into every page and even started borrowing more books afterward. As winter crept closer, Ash blurted that the cold was getting sharper by the day. Everyone nodded, and then they spotted the stack of books he was lugging around. "Do you really need all those?" someone asked. Ash just grinned and said, "I've already read them. I'll return them as soon as I'm done." Folka stared in disbelief at how fast Ash devoured those books. And even crazier, he'd figured out how to write all on his own. He stared in awe and realized Ash didn't feel like a typical kid at all. Falk leaned in and told Ash to sit down, saying he needed to talk about something important. Curious, Ash nodded and sat down, and the folks slid a book into his hands. Seeing his sharp mind, they urged him to read it, saying it was a special volume. Ash hesitated at the book because the letters didn't match the rest. They were neatly lined up like they'd been written, with terrifying precision. Folk wanted to know if Ash could even read it, and Ash confessed that he was scared as hell. He stared at the page like it was speaking a foreign language, then blurted out, "So, what's this book even about?" Folka leaned in and told them the book wasn't just any story. It was a copy of a manuscript from some ancient civilization. As soon as Ash heard that, his face tightened with worry, and Folka shot him a question. "Have you ever read about ancient civilizations before?" Ash said he'd heard the rumors. Sure, but deep down, he wasn't ready to believe they were real. He brought up those wild legends about civilizations like that, then pressed me. Was the manuscript really born in that ancient age? Folka confirmed this manuscript really did come from an ancient civilization. And he told us how long he'd been grinding to read and understand it, digging through research right in the royal capital. He still pushed forward, even after consulting scholars and experts in the field, even after pouring huge sums of money into the manuscript and grinding on it every single day, he still barely had anything to show for it. Because he couldn't deliver the results they demanded, they shoved him off to a remote village, yet he kept grinding on his manuscript even after the transfer. Ash couldn't shake the question. Why did Folka feel so obsessively drawn to ancient civilizations? Foki admitted he didn't fully get why he was so obsessed, but he sensed his curiosity was way too similar to Ash's. They both nodded and swore that no matter how brutal the setbacks got, they'd keep chasing the answers they wanted. While they huddled over the manuscript, Ash couldn't believe his eyes. He'd always thought it was just a made-up story. Nothing real. Folk cut in that. Sure, some myths about ancient civilizations could be lies, but the manuscript didn't read like fiction at all. It screamed that those people truly existed. Ash demanded to know if those so-called legendary technologies from those ancient civilizations were real or just myths people sold. Folk admitted he couldn't be sure, but he refused to lose hope. Ash couldn't believe it. The thought of a world where future tech could rewrite everyday life, from meals to clothes that keep changing with you, blew his mind. Medicines that could slam your wound shut in record time, plus lamps that blaze bright without a single flame. And they built those buildings with mind-blowing high-tech techniques. He kept thinking that the life he'd only ever dreamed about might have once been real inside those ancient civilizations. He dove into the ancient language, hunted its hidden secrets, and prayed it would lead him back to the rich, thriving life he remembered from his past life, while Ash couldn't shake the thought that those ancient civilizations really might have been real. He dug up a bunch of books that didn't treat them like silly myths at all. These stories painted real-life legends, packed with societies that were actually ahead of their time, and the longer he thought about it, the more it felt like those civilizations could have truly lived and thrived once deprived. He figured that if he could crack these ancient societies by decoding their forgotten language, then the wealth and knowledge they buried away might come back too, so wild it felt unreal, like prosperity and progress were about to return to the world. Ash told Folka he had to dig deeper into that ancient civilization, and Folka just snapped back that she could always count on his reliability. Ash had already hinted that some letters matched, and now it was proven, and that's when he said researchers had finally agreed. Ancient civilizations were split into just two kinds. Folka says the early civilizations' characters didn't vanish, they got handed down to later peoples, and some even survived all the way to today. But as the writings passed through generations, too many symbols shifted and a huge chunk of the original text was lost. Ash finally understood why he'd been fighting to read most of those words, because he'd been told the manuscript was believed to come from an early ancient civilization. He asked to dig deeper into the manuscript, and the folk nodded along. Then they demanded Ash come straight back if he spotted anything major. While Ash kept reading, he realized half the letters were missing, and the whole text fell apart into something he could barely decode. The ancients left behind a mountain of unknown symbols, and it hit him like a wave. He couldn't stop wondering if there was even a way to crack their meaning. While Ash was poring over the manuscript, he spotted a word that lit up the past. His father's old symbol, the one he used to draw in the dirt, meant the job was done. His father swore it was an ancient spell meant to make the fields grow better. Ash's stomach dropped. He suddenly spotted the symbol and thought, wait, it looks just like the character I'm seeing in that manuscript. He started to wonder if those letters weren't even sounds at all. Maybe they carried their own meaning, like ideograms with power of their own. Ash leaned in and told Folka the truth. Those letters in the book weren't real letters at all. They were pictures that somehow carried the message. Folka blinked in confusion at the suggestion. Ash jumped in and said the characters were basically picture signs, then told them to try communicating that way. He pointed at Folka, and Folka instantly got the message. Ash was signaling him. Ash jabbed at himself, then mimed opening and shutting his mouth like he was talking right then. Folka finally got what Ash meant by those pictorial characters. To prove his point, Ash sketched a near-identical symbol on a sheet of paper. Then Folk finally caught what Ash meant. He wasn't talking nonsense. He was talking about pictures and symbols that made these characters click in his head, and Ash totally backed up Folk's read, even pointing at one of Folk's own marks to say it was him, warning that those old words were packed with way more meaning than they seemed. Folk found that idea way too intriguing, and they practically blurted that it finally explains why they'd met so many different characters. He added that this breakthrough proved they'd uncovered at least 3 brand new characters. Ash nodded and leaned in, guessing the ancients probably built everything around picture symbols. Folka stared in disbelief somehow. All those characters, even by the dozens, clicked together like they'd been made to fit. They still couldn't shake the feeling that this whole maze might cause trouble, but Volka just shrugged and said it was only a hunch. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were one step away from uncovering something huge. Discovery hit, and the whole folk crowd nearly burst with joy. They grabbed Ash and shouted how huge this breakthrough could be, how they couldn't wait to see their theory proven. Ash tried to calm the man down, but Folka's excitement still blazed right through. Folka praised Ash's sharp insight, and the two kept leaning in, grilling every possible consequence of what they'd uncovered. Ash watched Folka sink deeper and deeper into the ancient language, like the words were pulling her in harder every day. Worried for his own sake, Ash clocked Fuka's breakneck pace and realized he'd burn out fast, so he stayed close while he borrowed the books, because just asking how he wasn't going to keep Fuka safe. Later, while Ash studied alone in his room, He stared at the grim truth of his village's short life expectancy, where people lived in non-stop terror and even a simple cold could kill them, so he couldn't afford to waste a second chasing every day like it might be his last. Every day he devoured books like fuel, fueled by one burning mission to dig up the hidden riches of ancient civilizations. Even though he craved to get there fast, he couldn't ignore the truth. He had no clue where to find all the answers he suddenly needed. Then his father, David, snapped out at him in a furious, sarcastic voice demanding to know if Ash had time to help or if he was just planning to get lazy from reading too much. David then launched into a stern lecture and Ash snapped back, asking how he could possibly help then David told them Quid the merchant had finally arrived to sell his goods, and that they planned to unload their extra wheat harvest too. Ash froze as it hit him. Quid's visit was here, right on time. When Quid finally showed up, David snapped that it felt like no demons would dare mess with him now, and Ash greeted Quid with a sharp look. This merchant wasn't just walking confident, he looked like he'd dodge every ounce of trouble. Ashy sat there thinking, because he'd been aching to uncover what those so-called demons really were all along. Whether they were savage beasts, cutthroat thieves, or something stranger, he couldn't get a real answer. Every time he questioned them, they brushed him off with childish excuses, and his curiosity still burned. Then David hauled out the quid and showed him the wheat they planned to sell. Quid checked it over and declared the winter wheat top-notch tight, well-packed, and ready to go then. Offered 4 copper coins to buy the whole batch. David leaned in and asked, "So how much is that in iron coins?" Quid shot back, 80. David nodded, snapped up the deal, and loaded his cart with more than just that salt, the usual herbs, grinding stones, and fever reducers. Quid told everyone straight up, that jar of salt would set you back 12 iron coins. A bundle of herbs cost 15. The grinding stone was 8, and even the bottle of fever-reducing pills came for 8 iron coins. While David sifted through the goods, he spotted a strange new jar and blurted, "What's that?" Quid leaned in and told him it held honey wine, and it would cost 20 iron coins. David asked for a discount, but Quid smirked and said he'd probably buy it anyway. Ash then snapped that if they didn't grab some clothes, their mother would be absolutely furious. Quid lit up and praised Ash's quick thinking, and Ash immediately asked if Quid could spare 2 extra needles. Quid told him to hold on, then explained that the cloth was 10 iron coins. But those 2 needles would cost 6 more. As Ash snatched the cloth, he grinned and said, "That's it. Now we've got everything we need." David's eyes kept snagging on that honey wine, so he demanded one more round, and Quid immediately cut him a tiny deal. Only if David kept it quiet and didn't tell anyone else. David was thrilled, slammed Quid's hand, and bragged that he was the best merchant in town, while Ash shot a worried glance at his dad like, "How many times will you poke the bear before mom explodes?" Quid just shrugged and told Ash the discount was barely a thing, 4 copper coins. So there was nothing to worry about. 4 copper coins, so there was nothing to worry about. Ash shot back that it wasn't the discount that worried him. It was the price itself. Quid explained that even if he sold the goods in the city, he could get a higher price, and that's why the discount made sense. Ash then snapped his finger and showed Quid the mistake. Quid froze, staring at him in shock, and demanded, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Ash stared at Quid's lightning-fast math and snapped. "If we leave the alcohol out, it totals 59 iron coins. So how in the world does that work, when winter wheat alone is worth 80? Even with the original alcohol price still counted, there should have been coins left over." Ash shot back that if Quid tried to cheat them, he'd have no choice but to march straight to the church, and he swore Priest Foka would blast the truth to the whole village, shutting Quid's scam down for good. Then Ash explained, "Straight up, no matter how skilled you are, even the best merchants can still make mistakes." He vouched that Quid had always treated the village right and could be trusted with anything, and Ash swore he wouldn't tell a soul because it was just an honest slip, and humans mess up like that all the time. He said the same nightmare had happened before with Jewel and Ban the Hunter. Ash brushed off the mistake and told him straight up that Quid had already earned trust, so he urged him to keep protecting that reputation. Quinn shot him a grateful smile, then pressed a small token into his hand's fine fabric and asked Ash if he liked it. Ash took the gift on the spot, convinced their deal was solid and sure. QYD would keep being a dependable merchant as long as the prices stayed fair. David pushed Ash to move faster, and Ash nodded, grinning that he couldn't wait to deal with Quid again down the road. Right after the deal closed, Ash rushed over to Foka, then asked if he was truly eating right. Foka shot back with a sly jab, quipping whether Ash had just decided to become his wife. So Ash froze, backing up a step, baffled. Then Foka went on to say that Ash's worry was way too intense, making him look like an overly nosy intruder for someone as young as him. Ash snapped back that if a kid feels forced to stress over an adult, then that adult better look in the mirror, own his actions, and start doing what he's supposed to. Folka couldn't help but comment on how effortlessly Ash was talking, and Ash shot back asking if he'd made any progress decoding those ancient texts. Folka admitted he still hadn't cracked much, but he had finally spotted a handful of names that kept showing up over and over in the manuscript. Ash felt a spark of hope and ripped through the papers Folka handed him. And when Folka pointed out these names could have been passed down for generations, Ash couldn't help but believe they were the key to unlocking the text. Feeling the momentum, Ash grabbed a few books for himself and tracked down the locals, asking if he could borrow several that very day. Folka nodded along, saying it was exactly how their arrangement worked, and Ash added that this agreement was built on an old practice. He grabbed a pile of storybooks and hunted down books on general education to help the village grow, then clutched the stack and told Folka, "I'm heading to the cathedral." As Ash finally found a quiet spot to settle in, he couldn't help but grin. Travel diaries were pure gold. Then he clocked the real twist. The collection was packed with old technical books and even preserved smithing work from ancient times. He couldn't stop staring at that botanical guide, and he kept asking himself if it would actually help him learn the secrets of plants. Right then, a girl from the cathedral swung the door open and greeted Ash with a warm, welcoming smile. She couldn't shake the feeling that the girl had just been hit with one more reminder of how truly weird South was. A boy who stayed weirdly calm, so mature it felt like he'd seen everything already. That's why she froze in shock when she spotted him burst out of the church grinning with a smile she'd never seen on him before. That church was supposed to be for studying, and Father Folk always pushed that idea. Yet she'd never once seen a soul reading inside, because everyone was slammed with work all the time. Still, South showed up at the church every single day to study, and that nonstop routine made her wonder if he actually loved it, or if something else was driving him. She hated studying with her whole soul, and she honestly couldn't wrap her head around the idea that South might actually enjoy it. His real smile hit her like a punch so good it terrified her, and she couldn't tear her eyes away. Before she could even process it, she yanked the church door open and froze right in front of Ash, staring him down. Ash greeted Micah with a warm smile the moment she arrived, while Micah watched him still buried in his book. And when she finally got his attention, she asked if he'd started reading there recently. Yeah. He backed it up, said, "I did," and then told me he borrowed the book from Folka. Micah leaned in and asked if he was loving it. Asha nodded and said yes. Greed gnawed at him, and then he blurted out, asking if she'd come to see Folka. When she nodded yes, he said Folka's inside and asked if she wanted him to call him. Micah didn't hesitate. He agreed. And Ash rushed off to tell Folka that she'd come to see him. Spoka, the ultimate gentleman, leaned in and asked what on earth brought her here. Ash couldn't stop thinking about how wildly different Folka sounded with everyone else compared to how he acted when it was just them two. Micah went to Folka and begged her to teach her how to write, saying she'd been mulling it over and couldn't ignore it anymore. Ash couldn't believe it. Micah, the mayor's daughter, was begging to learn how to read and write. He stared at the grim truth: no one in his village could read or write, except the mayor's family. Because Klein, the mayor, could read, write, and calculate like it was second nature. The exact skills the village needed to run. Ash figured Micah's urge to learn kicked in after she saw him slipping into the church, and that's what pushed her to chase an education too. He even remembered how Iwaika, the mayor's wife, had lit a spark in him, turning books into something he finally truly loved. Set up these reading sessions, and somehow they planted a spark of hope in him, like he could keep going and actually live. Without her, Micah kept asking himself what kind of life he would have ended up with, and Father Folka promised he'd back her with her studies, though he warned he couldn't always be there because other duties would pull him away. He said Ashens they were the same age could read and write too, and he practically pitched him as the perfect companion for her, and Ash just stared, stunned, wondering why she picked him. Micah nodded in. Folka slammed the matter shut, and Ash's eyes widened. He could only hope they'd actually listen to him for once. Folka pushed Ash forward, calling him his best student, even as she looked just as lost as he did. Ash nodded along, still baffled by what was happening. Folka then cut the conversation short, saying he had other stuff to deal with, and he walked off. Ash couldn't shake the feeling that Folka had basically handed him the job just to see if he could crack that ancient language. When Micah clasped her hands in a desperate little plea, Ash's heart clenched like, if she could learn to read, he'd finally have someone to share his books with. He predicted it would feel awesome, said yes without hesitation, and grabbed a stack of books to kick off their study session. He shoved Micah the very book he'd begun with. They said it held the very scriptures priest Folka relied on when the festivals and ceremonies lit up the town. Since Micah already knew a few of these scriptures, Ash figured this was the fast lane to help her learn even more. Then he slid the first book toward her and told her exactly where to start, and Micah leaned in to ask Ash what the first word he'd ever learned was. Ash chanted the words, "O strong wolf god." Wise monkey god, fierce dragon god, grant us your mighty power today as well. Then snapped that they were straight from the scriptures. Like the fact that she knew them already was obvious. Micah said they should kick things off right there, and Ash instantly nodded then, told her, "Say it after me," and had her repeat his words. When Micah drifted into her own head, he snapped her back, telling her to lock in and focus. He jabbed at a spot in the book and said Shiki the wolf god was mentioned there. Then explained that people believed he had a body as strong and healthy as a fortress, so they prayed to him when a child was born, or when hands needed strength for hard work. Micah finally got what strong really meant. And Ash kept going, saying it wasn't just strength, but a rock-solid resolve, the kind that stays resilient no matter what. Micah nodded along, and Ash urged her to fire off questions every time something felt fuzzy. No guessing allowed, because if it got too tricky, they'd huddle up with Folka together and get the answers. Micah then fired off a question about the wise monkey god, and Ash told him, "Wise means sharp and clever, so when you study, you better pray to that monkey god and hunt wisdom." Micah got it instantly and told them they should go pray, and Ash nodded right away, proud that Micah was so locked in. He was thrilled they could keep studying, and not once did he feel ashamed for. They clasped their hands in prayer, then dove right back. And Micah was genuinely loving every page. As night rolled in, Folka showed up and said both of them looked way too hyped for their first day. Then he pointed out the sky was going pitch black and told them it was time to head home. Ash agreed, but Micah glanced outside, muttered that it was super dark, and admitted she didn't like it one bit. Then Ash stepped in and offered to walk her home. Micah froze because their houses were totally opposite directions, and he still had to get back himself. Ash swore he wouldn't leave her alone even for one night. Folk warned that the dark roads could bite, then urged Ash to make sure Micah got home safe. Micah froze for a moment, but Ash leaned in and told her, "Don't stress, everything's gonna be okay." As they headed out, Ash shot an apology for dragging out their study session, and Micah waved it off like, "It's totally fine," before the rest of his sentence trailed off. She praised him like he was unstoppable, and even though they were around the same age, she couldn't believe how fast he picked up letters and how deep his knowledge went. Ash just figured it had to be memories from a past life, but he couldn't shake the fear of what would happen if anyone found out about them, so he decided to keep it from her, because he didn't want people to label him as weird or turn his past memories into some huge spectacle. From those memories, he pushed Micah to keep going, telling her she could already read more words than before, and he honestly couldn't believe how far she'd come. Micah hesitated and asked if it was really true, then admitted she still didn't know every letter yet. Ash told her, "Keep going at this pace and you'll nail it soon. Trust me. You'll be fine." Micah was so fired up by Ash's encouragement that she didn't even clock the little stone in her path and almost ate the ground. When she stumbled, Ash snapped her hand up fast and demanded, "Hey, are you okay?" Micah's cheeks flared at the touch, and shyly waved it off, saying she was totally fine. Ash blinked at how much darker it got than he expected, so he urged them to keep holding hands for safety. Then Micah, cheeks burning, blurted, "Why?" "Why?" Ash went serious fast. He said it would be awful if she got hurt. And then he straight up called her the most precious person to him. And Micah's cheeks turned even redder. Ash leaned in and reassured her, "You're precious. Seriously, you are." Then he noticed something was off and asked what was wrong, especially since she was the mayor's only daughter. Micah leaned in and demanded to know what was inside the book Ash was clutching. He told her it was all about plants and trees, and she couldn't help but ask if that stuff was actually fun. Ash grinned and said it was way more than interesting. It was downright useful. He said the book was a survival guide listing plant species you could eat and naming the ones with medicinal power packed, so full of real, practical know-how about every kind of vegetation. Helped them spot plants and trees that could boost their food or grow more medicine. Micah couldn't contain his excitement, blurting out, "Wait, is that really possible?" Ash couldn't believe it. He stared at the book's power, swore it was truly valuable, and then broke down why it mattered, that it'd be a blast to read and you'd actually learn something along the way. He said the church was packed with tons of amazing books, and he was sure Micah would love them too. Then Micah snapped that she'd study her hardest from that day on, and Ash pushed her to keep working just as diligently. When they finally hit Micah's place, she thanked him for walking her back, and Ash yanked his hand away like the moment was over. Then he smiled and told her it wasn't a bother, saying he'd head home and catch her later. Micah agreed, but the second he turned to go, her heart jolted. She hated how casually he let go of her hand, and she secretly wished they'd stayed like that a little longer. Ash, sensing it was time to hunt wild plants, went straight for the botanical guidebook to see what cool ones they could track down. The very next day, right as Ash geared up for his outing, he looked out and realized the sky was perfectly on his side for the job. After drilling down with the botanical guide, he finally felt ready to hunt wild plants while the other kids just stared, baffled by Ash's crazy drive. A girl urged the whole group to stay close, warning them bears were lurking deep in the forest so nobody dared wander off too far. Micah caught up with Ash and instantly noticed the fire in his eyes for the day ahead. Ash grinned and admitted he'd been going deep with the guide, soaking up tons of research. She leaned in and asked Ash if he'd hunt for plants he could use for food and medicine, and Ash nodded, saying he began by tracking down plants like the ones in the guide. Then Micah cut in, pointing at some grass, and demanded, "You mean this?" Ash leaned in, took one look, and said it totally matched the one in the picture. When Jekyll closed in on Ash and Micah, he snatched Ash's hand and begged, "Help me." Ash peered ahead and spotted promising plants, then told everyone to head that way. Last year, ferns exploded in this spot. And right on cue, someone else shouted to Jekyll for help. Micah shot Ash a grin of good luck and took off by herself while Ash warned her to stay sharp because Ash was on a countdown. And just, Jekyll and the other boy kept going, and Ash couldn't ignore it this year. Ferns had exploded everywhere. Then he lit up when he found the patch, and they started snatching up the ferns while Ash swore they needed more than that. So he set off to hunt down the other wild plants he'd spotted in the botanical guide. While he was out exploring, Ash caught sight of a leaf that looked like aloe, clocked it as a lifesaver for cuts, stomach troubles, and skin problems, and suddenly remembered how it saved him back in his past life. And when he finally found it, it hit him like a revelation. Then he pushed onward, and he just suddenly crumpled to the ground and blacked out. When Ash jolted awake, he realized he was completely alone in some strange, unfamiliar stretch of forest. He started moving again, forcing his mind to recall why he'd stepped into the forest in the first place to grab herbs, and then sudden pain hit him hard. A brutal throbbing rocked his head, and then he spotted blood panicking, wondering if he'd smashed it into something hard. Ash snapped back to reality and realized somehow he'd ended up in this mess after wandering alone for ages. He feared the danger was real, and he knew he had to blaze a path back to the village. Ash stared at his dreams and mapped them out, helping Folka crack the ancient text, tutoring Micah in reading and writing, and finally finishing the book he'd been dying to read. He knew he had to make it back to the village at any cost. Staring north, he caught the way to the town, and when he said it out loud, his thoughts snapped into place. Then confidence hit him. He could survive the notice. Seeing the sun sink low, Ash realized heading home in the dark would be asking for trouble. So he decided to camp in the forest for the night. He double-checked everything: his botanical guide, spare coat, hand towel, knife, backpack, and even flint and steel, and walked out feeling way more prepared than he had any right to. First, he realized he had to spark a fire before the sun fully disappeared, and then he started hunting for water, because he knew he'd need to drink before things got worse. As he kept hunting for herbs, his eyes locked onto an aloe plant that looked way too familiar, the kind of familiarity that hit him hard, like it had been there when he'd lost consciousness before. He snatched up a handful of aloe, and as he reached for, I caught the rush of water nearby, followed the sound, and suddenly, there it was, a river. Ash eyed the water, tempted to take a sip, but even with all its beauty, he knew better. Drinking raw, untreated forest water could spell sickness. He wished he had a pot to boil the water, but since he didn't, he swore to himself he'd save it only for true emergencies. Then he decided to stay the night, scrounging up sticks and leaves like his life depended on it, because he was about to light a fire. He decided to use the aloe to heal his wounds and even the head injury that hit him right after. Once the fire finally caught, he dropped down beside it, soaking up the crackling warmth and the glowing light like it was saving him. He tucked some aloe into a leaf, pressed it to his head wound, and the pain snapped away fast. Then he couldn't stop wondering if that aloe's jelly would taste more like a veggie or like juicy fruit, because everyone keeps saying raw wild stuff is crazy delicious and it just might be the perfect thirst quencher. As he thought back to all the scraps he'd stumbled across, he rinsed them off and got them ready to hit the pan. With the flames roaring and a meal ready to go, he felt hope ignite in his chest, like he might actually make it through the night. While his stomach rumbled like thunder, Ash started craving meat like he couldn't resist the call of hunger. He was betting on a snake showing up, so he could lunge, catch it, slice it open, and drink its blood. By the crackling fire, he nodded off and jerked it into sleep. Next morning, he jolted awake, drained to the bone, then decided to grab more aloe and start harvesting again. He figured that if he couldn't get out of the forest, the aloe's water might keep him alive, but he still needed real drinking water to stay fueled and energized. Even though he knew aloe could work wonders for skin and wounds, he also realized that overdoing it could seriously backfire. He started hunting for other water-rich plants, or else he'd boil the river water, flipping through the guidebook to figure out how. He stumbled onto the idea of a paper pot, paper shaped like a pot, reliable for a quick job, and it wouldn't catch fire until the water inside actually started boiling, and Ash's mind lit up with it. If he could mold the paper into a pot and wrap it with leaves, maybe it could survive the flames just long enough to boil the water. So he gritted his teeth and decided right then to test it for real. Following his plan, he smashed out the pot, boiled the river until it steamed safe, and took a long drink. Then pure relief hit him like a wave, so he set about making even more water. While he was hunting for his next meal, he spotted some fish and grinned. He could barely wait to bite into them. He hefted his basket and got ready to snatch fish, betting they'd be safer to chow down than plant so long as he kept the fire burning. After landing 2 sizzling catches, he practically couldn't wait to cook them up. With sticks pinning the catch, he hauled the fish right up to the fire and roasted them until they were golden. He figured that if he kept himself stocked with food and water, he could dodge the slow, brutal death of starvation. Clutching food and water, he finally felt steadier, and he made up his mind to grab even more before heading back to the village the next day. As the fish roasted, he shut his eyes and prayed to God right like he always did. Right as he was about to take his first bite, he suddenly signaled for someone to come up from behind. The story cuts to Folka. Yuka shows up with a box of food, then demands, "Is this enough?" Folka flipped through the contents and confirmed it was a lifesaver. Then Yuka couldn't stop praising how useful and awesome it was. And she pointed out that Folka had been tending to Micah lately because, as the head family elder in the village, Micah needed to lock in on her studies. Yuka wondered if Folka's mood had finally lifted since Ash started showing up, and Folka said, "Ash is easy to talk to." Right then, Micah burst inside, sobbing her heart out and shouting for her mom. She crumpled to her knees and Yuka snapped, asking why she was screaming like that, and if she'd finally finished picking wild vegetables. Micah snapped and told them Ash hadn't come back from the forest. Yuka pressed for more details, and Micah explained that Jekyll was the very first to realize Ash was gone. While everyone else swore Ash could still be out there in the forest and pushed for more searching, Micah freaked out over one thing: bears. So they ditched the hunt and hauled back to the village to warn the adults. Micah looked panicked and helpless, spiraling over one terrifying thought: what if Ash got mauled by a bear? Yuka pulled her into a tight hug, telling her not to worry. She swore the whole village would be out there, searching for Ash. Micah kept sobbing, terrified he'd disappear without a trace and never get found. With sobs roaring louder, Folka snapped that crying her heart out wouldn't change a thing. He shot her a warning. As she burned through every tear right now, Ash coming back would find her with nothing left to cry. He leaned in and promised her Ash would come back for sure, then laughed that even a bear couldn't lay a claw on a demonic kid before the Reaper seized Folka, forced him to stamp a weird contract, and dumped him back home. Folka prayed Micah would hold back her tears until Ash came back. Believing tears were a woman's deadliest weapon, she demanded Ash get an overflowing supply of them. 3 days later, the scene snaps forward. Ash is back, but the villagers are still drowning in grief, eyes heavy and hearts broken. Even Folka felt the crushing weight of what was happening once the search got shut down, and somehow it felt impossible to believe that even a child in full distress could still be safe. Yuka told Folka that every villager had shown up, then pushed him to start Ash's funeral. Folka demanded to know if she was really sure, because nobody had officially confirmed Ash was dead. Yuka confessed she had the same doubts, but even after all that searching, they still couldn't find Ash. People insisted he could handle the funeral on his own if he had to, but he couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if he returned afterward. And Yuka shot back that it was totally fine if Ash came back, but she begged Folka to keep his real feelings locked up, especially from Ash's parents, who were already hanging on by a thread. Folka wrestled with a choice because no matter what, he refused to believe Ash was dead. He was dead sure Ash would lean on everything he'd learned from those books and fight his way through. Ash stared down his books, and he couldn't help wondering, when was Ash going to come asking for the next one? He leaned in and told Yuka to hold off just a little longer. Yuka leaned in and asked him straight up if there was a real reason he was determined to wait. Just then, Ash burst in, hesitating as he asked why everyone had gathered, and a shock hit them like a wave the moment they saw him. Ash's parents nearly burst with emotion and sprinted in to slam him into a hug. Sheila burst into gratitude, thanking God Asha was back, while David admitted that Ash's disappearance had everyone panicking. Ash, baffled by the chaos, caught whispers about himself and snapped, asking what everyone was saying and what scheme they were cooking up for him. Bulky finally admitted he was seconds away from starting Ash's funeral. Ash was still reeling. He demanded why Folka would say that to him, his face full of worry, even as he pointed out it had only been 3 days. Everyone laughed off his remark, and it totally caught Ash's mom off guard. Yet she forced a calm smile anyway. Micah strode up to Ash and demanded, "Is that really you, or just some imposter wearing your face?" Ash checked that he was safe and back, even though exhaustion clung to him. Then Micah burst into tears. They slammed him as an idiot and then couldn't help but breathe a huge sigh of relief when he finally came back. Even through her tears, she couldn't stop crying pure, bursting joy because he was finally back. Ash swallowed his pride, apologized for the worry he'd sparked, and then exhaled in relief because he was finally safe. The village folks hailed Ash as a hero, and they couldn't stop asking how in the world did he pull through those last 3 brutal days. Ash started telling his story, and right when he was about to chow down on some fish, a man suddenly showed up. Ban. Ban sat beside Ash, and when Ash offered him a bite of fish, Ban just shook his head. Ash couldn't believe how unnervingly quiet he was. He realized Ban was the only hunter in their village who dared to slip into the wild alone, a master of the forest like nobody else. Ban wore his honesty on his sleeve straight to the point, no sugarcoating, so kids and adults alike couldn't help but feel a little intimidated. Seeing Ash's gloomy face, Ban leaned in and demanded to know what was wrong. Ash swallowed his pride, apologized, and admitted it was weird for him to be out there all by himself. And because things were in full chaos, he begged Ban to take him back to the village. Ban nodded, and Ash blurted out his thanks, shoulders finally dropping. Then he dug back into the fish, knowing he'd get home safe. As Ash chatted with Ban, he clocked how rushed he looked. Ban practically yanked him back to the village, and with Ban's help, Ash finally made it there. Ash pushed on with his tale, admitting that everything went sideways event after event. Yet he still pulled off the wild herb run, and the aloe was the reason he made it. Micah and Yuka shot Ash with fierce glares, and the unease hit him like a punch. Ash lowered his head and blurted out an apology for dragging them into trouble. And Yuka immediately shouted that everyone had been so worried about him, while Micah chimed in that she'd been scared too. Ash stayed totally calm, telling them, "I'm back safe and sound." And before they even processed it, they snapped at him for acting so composed-like his calm was the last thing their hearts could handle. While people in the crowd burst out laughing, some jerks said it was no big deal. Like Ash couldn't possibly die even if they had to kill him. Ash snapped back, furious, asking how anyone could believe that, because if he got killed, then yeah, he'd die. A few days after Ash came back, he replayed the Jekyll incident in his head. Those furious adults yelling at Jekyll, the very guy who'd been with him during that wild herb hunt, because Jekyll apparently shoved Ash off a tree as a prank and left Ash stuck in the forest. Ban later stormed into the forest, inspected the footprints right at the scene, and nailed Jekyll as the culprit. Since Ash made it back to the village safe and sound, the whole thing didn't rattle him too much. Ash finally realized that piling on too many pranks could land him in real trouble, and he fully believed Jekyll needed to pause before trying anything like that again. At first, he thought the villagers were blowing things way out of proportion just because they held a funeral for him. But when he looked back, the truth hit hard. If it happened to someone else, they might not have walked away alive. Running into Ban wasn't just lucky, it ended up being one of the best lessons he could have gotten. Ban was a deadly good hunter. He fed the whole village with wild game and even kept vicious animals off their doorstep. And when Ash heard he could not only track prey but also knew wild plants like aloe and the exact best places to collect them, he was blown away. Ash realized Ban knew wild plants in ways no book could ever teach. And with Ban in his corner, Ash felt ready to sharpen his skills, speed up his research, and cook up better foods and medicines for the village. He strode up to Ban and demanded a shot at being his apprentice, and Ban nodded right away. Then they sealed it with a firm handshake, while Ash beamed with gratitude and officially locked in his role as Ban's new apprentice. After that, Ash's life snapped back into its normal groove, and he teamed up with Ban again, continuing. He dove into his botanical research, starting with aloe. After he used it to patch up his wounds while he was stuck in the forest, he realized it still worked just as well as it did in his old life. And since it was so easy to get, he could mess around with it nonstop without ever fearing he'd run out. Ash yanked a rat from a box that kept trying to slip away. He stared at the spot where the aloe hit, and the wound was already healing faster than anyone could have predicted. He figured aloe could almost certainly work as an amazing ointment, and then his mind started racing about what else it could do. He kept staring at the rat's moves, and the spot where the aloe landed looked like it was begging to break out in a rash show. He figured the aloe's effect could swing hard based on how much got applied and for how long. As he pushed through his tests and experiments, he steadily upgraded his setup until it felt like a real lab. Then it hit him. Paper, a quill pen, and ink were the lifeline of his research. Ash stormed up to Quid to bargain for the supplies, and when Quid demanded to know what he wanted, Ash answered, "A pen and some paper," and Quid nodded and handed them over then. Once he had the items, Ash looked back and realized that when he'd come to Quid before, Quid had been acting downright nervous. And then it hit him. Quid totally clocked his broke situation and swung the bill onto his own tab, so Ash would still have to pay that debt back sooner or later. Meanwhile, Jeannie the rat had clawed her way into Ash's experiments, turning into an absolute game changer. Even though Guinea wasn't a pet, it still became the key test subject for uncovering how different medicines really worked. Ash knew the future would demand even more experiments, and he couldn't afford to skip a single necessary test. He kept wondering if anyone would think he was heartless for using rats in his experiments. But the truth hit hard. He didn't feel bad at all. Those little rodents were just pests to him. In a world where everyone was one bad day away from starving, they had to test invasive rodents. Because these little crop-devouring monsters could make or break a crucial experiment. He didn't even blink as he dragged them through brutal conditions and shoved down mountains of medicine. His hatred was so fierce he went stone cold to every single bit of their pain. Thanks to his guinea experiments, Ash finally cracked the secrets of aloe, and the results lit up his face. Aloe delivered an insane sweep of good effects. Then he had to find out if those awesome results would hit humans the same way, so he decided it was time to start testing on himself. He started with aloe's healing magic, smeared his salve onto one hand, and just sat there, holding his breath to see what would happen. He couldn't believe how much everything changed. The salve burned away every crack and hangnail on his hand, and the instant he saw the change, he nearly couldn't believe how drastic it was. Ash grinned seeing aloe finally work its magic on human skin still. He'd already tested it on Guinea first. Right then, Sheila, his mother, showed up at his side, begging him to help gather water. Ash nodded in agreement, and she thrust a bucket into his hands with a grateful, glowing smile. She couldn't believe her eyes. One of Ash's hands was suddenly silky smooth, way cleaner than it had ever looked before. Ash told Sheila he'd been testing aloe as a topical ointment, and when it actually worked, pure excitement hit him. Then Sheila gasped, stunned, and demanded to know if there was really an ointment that could make skin feel this smooth and silky. Then she asked if he still had some left, and Ash shot back, yeah, saying he was already planning to whip up more the moment he wrapped it up. Sheila snatched his hand and asked if she could use the ointment, and Ash nodded right away. He told her, it worked for me, but it might not fit everyone's skin. Then warned her to ditch it the moment she felt pain or itching. She nodded fast and asked if she could use it right away. Ash thrust the ointment into her hands, and while she rubbed it on, she lit up and admitted how insanely good it felt. Then she hoped it would leave her hands as smooth as his, and thanked him with all her heart. Ash couldn't believe how much Sheila loved the ointment, so he immediately decided to whip up a bigger batch just for her. He couldn't stop thinking. Maybe the whole village wanted in, not just the women, but the men, and even the kids too. Because he'd already clocked those rough, calloused hands everywhere, and he prayed that something this simple could finally level up their whole quality of life. Ash watched that aloe salve work like magic, and before long his mother's rough-battered hands were healed smooth. When he saw those positive results, his eyes widened. Way more people cared than he ever thought they would. Then Micah caught up with him, stared in shock at how spotless his hands were, and demanded to know what medicine had turned his skin so smooth. Ash tossed Micah and Yukiya the salve and dared them to try it too, warning them it was still a work in progress. Then the two jumped at the chance and eagerly agreed to help. Ash felt sure that spreading the salve village by village would level up everyone's lives. Then he saw how quickly people grabbed it, and his confidence shot higher as he wondered, wait, would they actually pay for this? He sat there, plotting test marketing across the city, and with everything he'd learned from books swirling in his head, Ash decided to hunt down even more answers. Micah caught him deep in a brutal, challenging book, leaned in, and teased that the stuff he was reading looked insanely tough. Then asked what he was studying right now. He flashed the book's title at her and dared her to say it herself. She tried, nailed it, and called it The Livestock Manual, and Ash's heart practically swelled at how much her reading had jumped. Micah's eyes lit up as he heard the news. Then he leaned in and asked if the manual covered real livestock like horses and cows. Ash nodded and explained that livestock meant animals you could raise and keep for different uses, and when Micah asked about meat production, Ash confirmed the manual had that too. He told them, if the aloe salve works, I'm putting that money straight into starting something brand new in this village. Still, his research screamed the truth. Raising livestock wasn't easy, and it demanded serious money, real know-how in animal husbandry, proper stables, a starting breeding pair, and a never-ending pile of expenses. Even though raising chickens was pretty doable, Ash warned that their clucking would lure wolves and even demons out of the forest, so keeping them safe in an isolated farming village was a nightmare. His research also made it crystal clear. Demons weren't just wild, dangerous creatures like wolves. They were something completely different. From what he could remember, old folklore swore a demon raid once wiped out an ancient civilization, and Ash couldn't stop wondering what were demons really like and what kind of deadly trouble were they about to bring. He leaned in and told Micah to lock in on buying iron farming tools or whatever else could actually help. because he was still wrestling with his choice. Micah shouted that he was amazing, and he shot back modest as ever that he hadn't done anything big yet. But she wouldn't let him down, insisting it was all true, and gushing that the aloe salve made her hands look spotless and feel wonderfully clean. Ash stared at her hands and breathed easy, no rash, no swelling, nothing bad at all. With a grin, he leaned in and asked Micah how the salve felt. Did it burn? Did it itch at all? As he studied her hand, Micah suddenly felt something strange that sent a jolt through her. Ash yanked his hand back and blurted an apology because he just crossed a line of etiquette and Misty knew it. Micah reassured him, saying it was totally fine, no need to worry, not for a second. Even though Ash was still young, she felt in her bones that she deserved the absolute respect, not a crumb less. Mika swore she felt zero pain and not a single itch, and the salve had already turned her skin smooth as silk. News hit the air, and Ash lit up, saying it was a win and that Yukiya hadn't had a single problem with the salve either. Mika jumped in, adding that her mother was just as thrilled with how it all turned out. Ash's face lit up, and he urged them to start studying. Micah nodded right away, and they dove back into their lessons. Meanwhile, Yukiya stared in total shock at the brand new medicine Ash had just cooked up. She realized he'd basically unearthed technology from ancient civilizations, something the church usually kept locked away for its own researchers in the capital, not some random local temple. Ash pulled off all of this, and she could barely process it. It felt like some twisted prank that reality couldn't possibly support. But once that salve hit, the change was undeniable. Something real was happening, right there, right now. The villagers had never owned a real specialty before. Now they were holding a brand new product that didn't even exist back in the capital. They'd been squeezing every last drop out of their tiny resources for years, praying they could carve out a legacy for the next generation. Then, bam! A wild new resource suddenly landed in their hands. Unbelievable. And totally baffling. That medicine practically screamed for trouble, luring in anyone who couldn't stand Ash's insane achievement. Yukiya snapped to her senses and knew she had to act, because if she didn't, Ash and the villagers would be in real danger. She decided to invite Ash over for dinner, so they could talk through the medicine and figure out exactly what steps they needed to take next. She had to figure out what Ash really intended and whether this breakthrough was about to flip the village's future for good. When Ash finally reached Yukiya's place, he couldn't believe his luck. Yukiya was inviting him to dinner just to say thanks for the aloe salve. He rapped on the door, greeted everyone with a bright, "Good evening," and Micah yanked it open, welcoming him with open arms and real warmth. Ash thanked her for the invite, told her she looked even more dazzling than usual, and pointed out that the dress she'd chosen fit her like it was made just for her. She flashed him a warm thank you, matched his compliment right back, and told him straight up that Ash looked just as good. Ash thanked her again, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Micah's work busting his butt to greet everyone and lead them inside was way more exhausting than it should be for someone who was just a normal visitor. He also remembered how his own parents were constantly on edge, at home so tense. They even demanded he put on his best clothes. He came up to Ash and told him he looked every bit the gentleman, and Ash lit up, feeling genuinely honored by the compliment. Yukiya swung the door wide and urged Ash to make himself at home, and even Klein the chief stepped in with a friendly, full-on welcome. As Ash, Klein, and Micah slid into their seats, Yukiya stood ready and declared that, since their guest was here, dinner was go time. Ash practically lit up at the sight and the smell of the meal. Yukiya shoved food into his hands and told him to eat before it went cold. He nodded, then devoured it with careful, dainty bites. He shot right past the moment, nudging Yukiya to praise his top-notch manners, and the way he oozed gentleman vibes in Ash fired back that everyone there looked so sharp he was only copying their style, even though he wasn't usually that meticulous. But he'd completely lost control for a second. He praised the food, gushing that Yuki cooked like a pro, and even admitted he was jealous of her husband. Then he realized how young he was to be saying something like that, and embarrassment hit him hard. Yukiya blushed at the praise and fired a question at Klein, asking if he'd heard what Ash said. Meanwhile, Ash seethed with envy but couldn't deny. Yukiya was the classiest, most refined woman in the whole village. So Ash totally got it when Yukiya carried herself with that sharp, elegant grace, even though she never started out there. She'd been born and raised in the capital as the daughter of a powerful family. When Klein headed to the capital to start his apprenticeship, he and Yukiya just snapped, falling head over heels in love. Ash took Yukiya's hand and promised forever, though the heroic stories about their romance never made it to Ash's ears. After dinner, Ash leaned in and thanked Yukiya for the amazing meal, thrilled he'd loved it, and said she wanted to ask him a few questions, if he didn't mind, and Asha shot back that he'd be glad to answer. Yukiya blurted that her questions were all about the aloe salve, and she even said she heard he was thinking about selling it through Quid then. Ash confirmed. Yeah, he was still just weighing that option back then. Right then, Yukiya couldn't shake her growing worry. She was sure the medicine would sell like wildfire and pile real profit into Ash's family, but she couldn't shake the fear that he'd stick out like a sore thumb among the villagers. Ash answered that a sharp gap in wealth like that could absolutely spark discord among them. Yukiya chimed in, saying Micah always bragged about Ash's fancy vocabulary, then straight up asked if Asha got that kind of polish from some famous teacher. Asha nodded and admitted he'd once been Folka's top disciple though. In his heart, he couldn't shake the thought that Folka barely taught him a thing. Still, it was the perfect cover for moments like these. Yukiya flashed her confidence that Folka would be proud of Ash's wins, and she admitted that everything Ash had learned made their whole conversation flow like a dream. After talking things through with Klein, she told her that Ash's intentions were good, but warned that they needed a solid plan to prevent any more trouble. And Ash thanked her, admitting he'd almost wrecked the village. He finally clocked that his plan missed the bigger fallout, admitted his original idea never accounted for overspending, and then, while he knew he'd need a huge stash of money, he couldn't shake the fear that the villagers might get jealous. He realized outfitting the village with fresh supplies would cost a fortune, so he'd have to grind and save only to wonder how much trouble saving could bring, and what move would be the smartest. Suddenly, Micah exploded with a shout, begging Yukiya to stop bullying Ash, and Ash immediately pushed back. He claimed Yukiya wasn't hurting him at all, just being unusually kind. Yukiya grinned like she already knew the outcome, then dared Micah to defy her own mother. That smile landed, like a knockout punch somehow charming in the most unexpected way, and it only made her even more irresistible. Micah snapped back that if Yukiya was going to bully Ash, she'd make her regret it, no matter that Yukiya was her own mother, and Yukiya couldn't stop herself from wondering why Micah was so fiercely protective, and whether Ash was the one stirring up trouble. Ash finally got it. If Yukiya hadn't stepped in, his actions could have blown up everything with the villagers, and no matter how he tried, he couldn't deny Yukiya was speaking the truth. Mika swore it was the truth, saying Ash wasn't stingy, he was hustling to save up for the village to buy livestock and farming tools, grinding to figure out what would help everyone the most, and Yukiya nearly fell out of surprise at what she'd just heard. Micah said it again, praising Ash for always having the village in mind, and for being the real deal, a genuinely good person. Yukiya beamed and asked Ash if he was as handsome and charming as well, and Micah practically exploded with an ecstatic yes. Ash's face went red instantly, caught completely off guard by that bold compliment. When Micah saw it, heat flared across her cheeks, and Klein immediately scooped her up with gentle care. Ash then pressed Yukiya, asking if they were putting on some kind of act, but Yukiya shot it down, saying Micah was just painfully adorable whenever she reacted like that. Yukiya pulled Ash aside and sat him down to talk plans, then demanded to know if he really meant to use those profits from the medicine, just like he promised. Ash nodded and confirmed it, saying life in that village was brutal and he wanted to smash those hardships down as much as he could. Yukiya finally got why Ash needed livestock and tools, but he still wondered if buying things with Quid could really fix their food crisis. Ash admitted it might ease the pressure for him and his family, but it wouldn't be nearly enough when he still remembered the jaw-dropping splendor of his past life. His resources felt way too small for the task, so he didn't chase perfection. He just needed one solid standard, the kind everyone was desperately missing. Ash could feel it. That dream was straight out of a fantasy, and deep down he knew it might be too big to reach before his time ran out. But he vowed to carve out even a sliver of that dream, knowing he'd have to team up with society itself to make it real. If he couldn't pull it off by himself, he'd call in 100 allies, and if that still wasn't enough, he'd crank it up again and again. To make his dream real, he'd need the resources to feed 10,000 people. Even if that dream looked impossible, he still refused to quit. He told Yukiya he wouldn't be satisfied just making his own family's life easier. Everyone's happiness was his happiness. And he wasn't trying to play the hero or pretend he was some saint, but he was dead serious about making everyone else happy too. Yukiya couldn't help asking what luxuries he meant, and Ash straight up said it was simple he had a dream, not some fantasy one. Just the kind you see in books. A rich, comfortable life packed with conveniences. It felt like the whispers of legendary ancient civilizations. But then reality hit. He craved modern comforts so bad he could practically taste them, only to realize he didn't even know the gritty details. He stared at the designs and applications of these breakthroughs and figured building it all from scratch would be way too wild, so he knew he'd need a whole crew of capable collaborators. Thinking back to Yukiya's earlier offer to help, he finally decided to take her up on it. Believing that this kind of support would keep him moving without stumbling, he pushed on toward his huge dream at a steady, relentless pace. He told Yukiya, since I'm donating the profits to the village, Help me hammer out the Alosal business plan. Yukiya said Micah's description didn't even scratch the surface. He sounded even more interesting. But yeah, a little scary. Too so, Ash rushed in with an apology for his weird vibe, insisting he wasn't some wolf in sheep's clothing at all, just a shy kid at heart with honest intentions. Yukiya lit up with heartfelt gratitude, saying she felt truly honored to help shape the business plan for such a generous cause, and that it would be her absolute pleasure to support it. Help when they clasped hands, Ash told her how honored he was to get her support, and his whole heart buzzed with gratitude. Now that his case had landed in the village chief's family's hands, he expected things to finally run smoother, and he was ready to use their ties to crack the city. Ash decided to hand Yukiya his salve recipe and step back from the sales and distribution entirely, trusting her to run it while he was happy to earn only a small profit if it meant the whole village got a better quality of life. This was the first real move toward his dream, and he went all in reading non-stop, one hard-earned step at a time until the life he wanted finally became his. The very next afternoon, Ash showed up at Yukiya's place to hand over the salve recipe they'd been talking about. She thanked him and admitted she'd been dying to get started. Then she pored over the instructions and realized the whole process was way more complicated than she'd expected. Still, she felt she could pull it off as long as she had the right ingredients, and Ash pushed for an update, asking her to tell him the moment she managed to make a batch. Then he slipped her a pile of ingredients to kick things off and told her he'd gathered them on his recent trip through the forest, with Bon admitting, straight up, that he wasn't exactly business savvy. So he'd leave the selling and pricing of the salve in her hands, only asking that she take the bare minimum for his cut. Yukiya leaned in and asked, "Are you really sure about this?" Because the medicine was his invention, and it felt downright wrong to let her take the reins. Ash told her he'd come to her for help because he couldn't juggle everything alone, and admitted there were a ton of details he'd never even think about by himself. He told her he believed in her and was happy to let her lead, promising he'd back her every step of the way so. When she agreed, she stepped out of her home with Ash. Yukiya said she'd try to craft a sales plan, and Ash couldn't help but thank her for jumping in. She also said she'd whip up the salve a few times just to figure out exactly how much the ingredients would stretch into. Yukiya remembered how interested Micah seemed in helping, so she thought, let's bring her in. Ash nodded and said it was a smart move because Micah could read the recipe too. Yukiya said Ash was the spark that helped Micah learn to read and write, but Ash shrugged it off, insisting Micah's own drive was what truly pushed her forward. Yukiya instantly found Ash fascinating, but then he finally clocked the missing piece. He still didn't get why Micah was driving himself so hard. Then she said she'd package up the salve, ship it to her parents in the city by courier, and after she made enough, she turned to Ash and demanded his opinion. He snapped back that it was an amazing idea, told her to run with it however she wanted, and she nodded, ready to handle everything and report back as soon as she saw results. Ash grinned, thanked her, and couldn't wait to hear all about it. After he bowed, he turned and left, convinced Yukiya could hold down the Alosal for a while, so he shifted gears, and his next move was clear. Start researching rodenticide to keep the storehouse stock safe from rats. As the days rolled on, Ash got word from Yukiya those Alosal were flying off the shelves. And somehow, his cut of the profits totaled a full, shiny copper piece. Yukiya told everyone she'd started hawking the medicine in the capital's fancy upper-class district, right where her parents lived, and now it had turned into a rare, exclusive treasure, with a brutal price tag to match. Ash couldn't believe it. His very first share was massive, because that one copper piece alone could pay for a full quarter of the winter wheat he'd need all year. Since Yukiya was taking care of everything and actually enjoying it, Ash finally felt like he could pay Quid back for the quill and paper Quid had given him. But the second Ash tried to hand over the money, Quid shut it down fast, refusing to take a single coin and insisting Ash keep it for himself. Ash realized that selling the salve didn't just pay the bills. It cracked open doors to wealthy families, giving him a massive edge and a real shot at building something big. And Quid called it a win that proved Ash's hard work. Quid even told him it was all because of him, and that he could still count on Quid showing up in the village, because that bond was turning into something beautiful. Ash then told Folka, straight to the point, that he couldn't talk Quid into taking the money, and if he brought it home, it would only land him and his father's. While father used it for beer, he shoved the money at Folka and told him to keep hold for a minute. Folka snapped back that the church didn't do things like that. Ash pushed back and said, "No, call it a donation." But Folka fired back, "Wait, it's a deposit," and fretted that with his morals constantly slipping, he might end up holding on to it for himself. Ash clocked Folka's stiff, clerical vibe and pitched a bold plan. If Folka couldn't hang on to the money, they should funnel it into a shared research fund, so both sides win as long as it's spent on ancient language research. Folka lit up. saying the idea was genuinely interesting, and Ash nodded, grinning because he knew those digs don't come cheap. Right then, Micah slammed on the door and demanded to know if Ash was inside, because he'd heard his voice. Folka welcomed her in and told Ash to help Micah with her studies. Then Ash asked how Folka really felt about the setup, because he could sense the pressure in the air, and Folka just smiled and said he trusted Ash to get it done right. Ashley, Ash, and Micah stormed out of the room, and Ash shot a grim remark about how hopeless it all felt, while Micah tipped her head and thanked them from the bottom of her heart. Her mom demanded they crank out more aloe salve because it was selling like wildfire. Yukiya even pitched the idea of roping in other villagers, so Micah turned to Ash and asked what he thought. Ash only said one thing. If 2G was okay with it, he was too. And Micah immediately promised she'd tell her mother that Ash approved the plan. Ash and Micah finally sat down to study, and Ash blurted out an apology for being the messenger. Micah just grinned and waved it off, saying she didn't mind at all and truly loved helping out. After the study session wrapped, Ash and Micah dashed to Micah's place only to find Yukiya and a handful of villagers already waiting there. Yukiya threw her gratitude at everyone who helped kickstart the village's brand new industry. She corralled everyone for one big batch of aloe salve, walked them through the steps again, and had them all nodding like, "Yep, this is the plan." Ash figured Yukiya had finally made the smart move, because that salve was handmade, and without extra hands, the work simply couldn't keep up. Yukiya ended up hiring the villagers who needed money, the worst widows, and caregivers nursing sick family members, women who couldn't handle heavy labor. With the town barely holding it together, Ash didn't see a reason for anyone to gripe about not getting hired. He called it a genius move to keep things running. And in his head, he weighed it all. Folka might have been a top-notch scholar, but Yukiya was the one who could truly run a business. Manager. To kick off their plan, they set up a practice session because every new recruit couldn't read a word, so they decided to hand them the recipe and drill reading skills at the same time. Ash spotted Tanya and immediately started coaching her on how to safely pull the spines from the aloe, showing the exact move step by step while warning her over and over to stay careful. Tanya thanked him, and he brushed it off. Don't bring it up. Then he leaned in and asked, Bill Tanya, or just Tanya? Tanya smiled and said, Tanya. That's what everyone calls me. Ash nodded along and told her, if anything in this gets confusing, don't push through, go, ask for help. Tanya finally confessed she couldn't read a single word, and the instructions were a maze she couldn't figure out. Ash leaned in and promised he'd break down the recipe step by step, telling her exactly how to read it as they cooked through it. Tanya nodded along, and then she clocked Micah teaching a different girl at the same time. So she leaned in and grilled Ash, asking how he and Micah learned to read and write. Ash told her the truth. They studied side by side back at church. Tanya jabbed a finger at a few words on the recipe and demanded to know what they meant. Ash told her those words weren't just talk. They laid out every step to make aloe salve, right there in the list. And then he showed her the first move, pulling off the spines, then peeling the skin, and didn't stop until she finally pushed through the process and nailed it. Yukiya truly valued everyone's work. And with a little practice, he started trusting himself, thinking he could make that salve every single time. No more guessing. That day's batch was just a test, so Yukiya pushed everyone to try it firsthand, swearing it could cure blemishes and prove it worked. He scrubbed the blemishes away until their skin turned ultra clear. Tanya snatched a piece of the final product, then stared at it like she was hunting for flaws. It hit her with this sharp déjà vu, like her mom used to whip up the exact same thing. Ash clocked her reaction, leaned in, and demanded she explain, because he was dying to know what her mom had cooked up. Tanya told me how her mom used to make a medicine that worked the same way, slapped on as an ointment for wounds, and rubbed in to smooth out rough, battered skin. She figured it was some kind of medicinal fix for rough, tough skin, but even so, she couldn't deny it. This stuff felt just like that aloe salve. Ash leaned in and asked Tanya straight up if she could remember every ingredient her mom used. Tanya remembered her mom never used regular honey. She swore by honeycomb. She told me how the honeycomb did the real work, while the honey stayed locked up for cooking and other uses, and she even remembered her mom tossing extra ingredients into the mix. But she couldn't for the life of her recall what they were. Ash couldn't stop wondering why they use honeycomb or what it was made of, and the moment he thought about it, he realized he knew almost nothing about its composition. He figured honeycomb could be just as valuable as honey, and honestly, it's wild bees don't just make it, they pour extra work into it to create something that special. His curiosity burned brighter by the second, sharpening into questions about the medicine's real details. Tanya's mom could have explained everything, but both of her parents were gone, so Yukiya pulled Tanya in to help. Tanya's father was the village's only beekeeper, and when he died, her mother stepped in fiercely tending the hives until she was taken too. They tore themselves away from their kids. Tanya and her little brother, Jiggle, both of them clueless about the trade their parents did. Ash stared at the brutal grind of the farming village and realized their hard-won skills, leftovers from ancient civilizations, could slowly vanish, blowing off into nothing like leaves caught in the wind. Tanya swallowed her pride, apologized for not remembering a single detail, and admitted she wished she'd helped with the beekeeping more while. Ash waved it off, telling her she hadn't done a thing wrong. Nope, he insisted that honey tasted so insanely rich and packed with nutrition that once he learned about honeycomb, it lit a fire in him and sent him straight into beekeeping. Yukiya said beekeeping is the heartbeat of any farming village, and when Ash asked if she really believed that, she didn't hesitate. She confirmed it. When Tanya's family raised bees, they didn't just pull honey from the hives, they brewed candles too, and the whole village reaped the benefits, so Ash was practically bursting with excitement over the idea. Then he leaned in and asked Yukiya if they could swing not just livestock, but beekeeping too. And Yukiya lit up, saying she'd been thinking the exact same thing. Ash said the next big move to level up village life was simple: dive into beekeeping research, and Yukiya shot back that he could count on her right on it. Ash admitted the real snag. He hadn't found a single beekeeping book in the church, so he'd have to hunt one down first, and until then, he felt about as useful as a helpless kid. Yukiya scoffed that helpless felt way too dramatic. But yeah, they were still nowhere close to taking their first step. When Tanya shot them a quick look, she blurted that her father owned a prized book with a honeybee on the cover. And it might be exactly what Ash needs. Ash gaped in disbelief and blurted, "So books really exist outside churches?" Then immediately begged for permission to read them. Tanya nodded in agreement, and Ash grabbed the chance to thank her fast, then practically urged her to move, but Tanya hesitated. She blurted that her house was a complete disaster right now, and Ash told her, "Don't stress." But she still couldn't shake that uneasy doubt. Soon enough, he finally talked her into it then. Right after, Yukiya and Micah rolled in, and Yukiya snapped that Ash was being way too harsh on Tanya, shaking her nerves to the core. She pushed to delay it. Micah nodded along, and Ash took one look at their worry, then said they should read the book outside instead. Tanya asked where they should go. Ash pointed at a spot just outside her house, and when she watched him, she realized Ash couldn't wait to start reading. Ash didn't hesitate. He straight up confirmed it, and everyone froze at how stubborn Ash was about getting the answer. Then he pushed even harder, asking Tanya if there wasn't any other way and exactly what he'd have to do to earn her okay. Tanya finally caved, and as soon as she promised he could do anything for the book, she agreed to hand it over right then and there. Ashley thanked her, then slipped away from the group and sprinted out of the house, practically yelling at Tanya to hurry. Memory. She told him to slow down as Micah trailed right behind them, and later a lady said she'd always pictured Ash as a reserved, quiet kid. So Yukiya nodded along, because everyone else felt the exact same way. When they pulled up to Tanya's place, Ash and Micah stayed outside waiting, while Tanya dashed inside to grab the book then. Ash started reading those hands-on beekeeping techniques. He practically devoured everything there was to know about beekeeping honeybees, figuring out which types to keep, the perfect temperature range, what to expect when they're most active, how to handle them safely, how to harvest the honey, maintain the hives, and finally process raw honey. He couldn't believe how deep it went, way past anything he'd ever expected. Ash couldn't shake the thought that those wild techniques probably didn't come from nowhere. They seemed like they traced back to ancient civilizations from later eras. It's wild how all that detailed knowledge survived intact, even if no one cites it much anymore, because the careful way it explains everything makes it feel like the book is built on the skill of those later civilizations. And honestly, I can't picture anyone in the modern world writing with that level of precision. It only deepened Ash's gut feeling that this book came from some later civilization. And when he held it, the pages felt like a relic dug straight from the past. And he couldn't believe it. Somehow, a relic this valuable turned up in a tiny little village. Micah finally slid in beside him and said, "We've talked bees enough for now," and Ash nodded along, admitting the book was straight up magnificent. He clocked that he'd need to study it even harder to catch every detail. But in the end, he was sure this book was the spark they needed to kick off a beekeeping business. Tanya leaned back and stared at the book like it meant something huge, then wondered if she'd finally get permission to read it too. Ash demanded to know how her father ended up with that book, and Tanya fired back that her dad said it was a family heirloom. So yeah, the family swore that their ancestors started beekeeping thanks to this very book, though nobody can say for sure how it was even brought into their hands. And the craziest part? People once praised their honey-making skills all the way beyond the village. Over time, the book was kept like a sacred heirloom. At least, that's what the story insisted. Tanya pointed out that because the whole account was handed down by word of mouth, you got to take it with a pinch of salt. And Ash quickly reassured her. He truly believed her family's story, and even went on to guess that her ancestors must have been able to read that book, learning its ridiculously advanced beekeeping techniques. He stared at the book and basically said, "This thing is straight from another age, and if that doesn't make it a real treasure, I don't know what does." Tanya looked uneasy and snapped that it was just a book they'd kept around the house, and she couldn't believe her family even owned something this incredible. Ash nodded, calling it a proper heirloom, and swore her ancestors must have guarded it like treasure just to pass it down generation after generation. He couldn't stop wondering how many years that silent, wise book had been hiding in her family's grip. It looked like ages had gone by since the family last used it, but somehow that heirloom never once slipped out of their hands. Even after a mountain of misery, they still pushed through everything just to guard a book they couldn't read anymore because its long-lost beekeeping wisdom, forgotten by the descendants, has finally been dug up again at last. Ash felt that steady, unshakable grit pulsing from the book's pages, and it hit him hard the courage of its authors, who fought to guard their knowledge from time's brutal ruin. He leaned in and told Tanya that this book was proof of everything her ancestors and parents fought to protect, so their beekeeping skills would live on, generation after generation. You're sure to carry that legacy forward, and Tanya couldn't help but wonder out loud if she could ever become a real beekeeper herself. She hesitated, but even with doubts, Ash shot her a reassuring grin. He'd explain the book's contents, and they'd learn it side by side. She made it crystal clear that the call to get those stolen skills back was always hers to make. Tanya lit up and confessed that becoming a beekeeper had been her lifelong dream. She told me she'd been watching her parents work since she was a kid, and deep down she'd always dreamed of stepping into their shoes. Before she could even learn a thing from them, her parents were gone dead and leaving her behind. That book they left behind was way too deep for her to figure out alone, so she slammed the whole attempt shut and went all in on one thing: surviving. Now she swore she'd try again, this time with the weight of her parents' legacy driving every step. Ash leaned in and promised her, with total conviction, that learning beekeeping would be his honor using the same methods her ancestors had guarded for centuries. Memories. Tanya nodded with pure excitement, and Ash exhaled in relief, because after her family's brutal fight against time for so long, that struggle was finally paying off. And that once-forgotten knowledge, moments from disappearing forever, was now in capable hands. Ash leaned in and told Tanya the road ahead was packed with a ton of hard work. He said he'd have to tear through that book fast to figure out where to start with beekeeping, especially since it was written in that old era. And he even hinted the text could be gold for his research into ancient languages. That's exactly why he planned to run straight to Father Foka and beg him to examine it. Ash leaned in and asked Tanya if she'd lend him the book, then let him stash it at the church, for now telling her the priest there was a sharp archivist who could read it, and that Foka could also keep the book from falling apart anymore. Ash handed Tanya the book, and she agreed only after Ash promised to treat it right and swear that anyone who dared mistreat it would pay a serious price. Micah and Tanya immediately snapped into alarm, telling him to quit all the dramatic talk. Jekyll, hiding behind a tree, snapped with rage at Ash for snatching Micah and Tanya right out from under him. Ash and Micah headed back together, and Ash couldn't stop raving about how insane this day had been. Then he pushed a plan. "Let's take the book to the church." And right after that, he leaned in and asked Micah if she'd deliver a message to Ukiah. Micah nodded, and Ash leaned in to tell Ukiah. Soon, they just might start beekeeping. Tanya will be the one leading it. And that was all Micah needed to pass on. Mike asked if she'd join him to read the book, and Ash didn't hesitate telling him it was pretty tough stuff, but he was sure they'd have a blast digging into it together. Right then, Jekyll burst in with two allies and shouted at Ash, demanding he come over. Ash dipped his head in apology and hurriedly said he had to deliver an important book to the church, then promised he'd come back and visit another time. He spun to Micah and barked at her to hurry, because the book couldn't stay out in the open for long while Jekyll lurched after them, shouting that Ash was a coward. Micah asked if Ash planned to let Jekyll talk to him like that, and Ash snapped, refusing to answer while Micah swore she was ready to face him herself. But Ash told her not to let it rattle her and push them to keep moving. Then he seized her hand and pulled her along, fast to right as her cheeks flared with a blush. That move ignited Jekyll's rage. He snapped, screamed, "I've had enough," and hurled a stone straight at Ash. Ash dodged it with no effort at all, and Jekyll just kept rubbing it in, sneering that Ash only thinks he matters because he brewed some skin medicine, then daring him to prove it with his next throw. Micah screamed that Jekyll had gone way too far. But Ash shoved a book into her hands and told her to back off fast right now so she could stay safe. She nodded, snatched the book from him, and Ash surged forward to confront Jekyll head-on right after Jekyll demanded to know if Ash had anything to say. Ash warned him if he so much as damaged that book, it would count as a straight-up declaration of war, and Ash promised that if it happened, he'd unleash a total assault with every weapon and trick he had. Ash swore that the moment Jekyll hurled another stone, he'd spend every waking second hunting him down and making him regret it. Shaken by Ash's fierce presence, Jekyll stared at him in pure fear, then snapped his eyes to Micah and asked if she was hurt. Micah said she was fine, and then thanked Ash for coming to her rescue. And she insisted she wasn't hurt, and Ash shot back that he'd done what had to be done, then pushed her to keep moving. That night, Micah told her mother everything about Jekyll and his crew, how they'd spat insults at Ash and even lobbed stones their way. Then she admitted the real gut punch, when Ash threw himself in front of her, shielding her from the danger. In the middle of all that danger, Yukiya listened with hawk-like focus, and she clocked Micah's admiration for Ash only growing hotter by the second. Yukiya told Ash it wouldn't take long before everyone else started clocking him fast, because the buzz was already spreading. She warned that in both good and bad ways, Micah would soon meet tons of people who hated Ash, just like Jekyll and his crew. Medicines. Yukiya couldn't stop praising Ash. He'd learned to read and write, brewed brand new medicines, and pulled off feats so fast and so brilliant that even adults were left in total awe. She grinned and told everyone she just knew Ash was headed for bigger things, like it was only a matter of time before he ditched the village and went out to make his name. Finally, Yukiya warned Mika that once you shine, people come out of the woodwork. Some will hype you up and help, but not all of them will treat you with kindness. She warned that plenty of people would seethe with jealousy, then try to sabotage Ash, stealing credit for his wins or even going after him to ruin everything. Micah couldn't help thinking everyone should cherish Ash, but she also knew that kind of perfect ideal probably wouldn't happen. As the village chief's only daughter, she couldn't ignore how everyone treated her like she'd been born with a golden crown. Knowledge. She leaned in and told Yukiya, "I get what you're trying to say." Yukiya, playing Micah's mother, couldn't shake the sting of shame her daughter had been pushed to put those worries into words. Still, she knew Micah's way of saying it all proved he'd grown into real strength, and that he could steady Ash when it mattered. Yukiya pumped Micah up to rally a crew who'd back Ash to the end, and to toss out anyone who came with harm on their mind. She pushed her to safeguard Ash and back him all the way as he chased his dreams. Micah couldn't stop thinking about the sheer weight of it all, because protecting someone as sharp and dependable as Ash felt like carrying a burden bigger than himself, with her always studying like a lone star way out in the distance. She couldn't stop wondering if she was really the one meant to stand between him and danger. Yukiya steadied her, saying that even if this job felt terrifying right now, Micah was exactly the kind of person Ash would need. She was sure that one day Micah would back Ash's dream with all he had and stand shoulder to shoulder right beside him. Micah admitted she didn't know if she could live up to those hopes, but she'd still push forward because her mom believed in her. Then Yukiya stroked her head, full of quiet confidence, and promised to teach her every single thing she knew, until Micah could succeed. Micah didn't hesitate. He threw himself onto Ash's path, chasing the same destiny. She vowed to give it everything, even with the trouble looming ahead, and she swore she'd protect him no matter what. They dove into the basics of beekeeping, then started spotting every tool they'd need and getting it ready for the harvest season about to hit. As Ash, Micah, and Tanya stuck to their routine, they huddled over what to do next. Ash insisted that setting the hive boxes near blooming flowers would make the honeybees grab pollen faster, but he noticed there weren't many truly great spots inside the village. He figured the best move was dropping the hives right by the village's farmland, because those bees wouldn't just buzz around, they'd pollinate the plants too, boosting the veggie yield and even pushing the native wild strawberries to grow bigger and better. Ash also eyed the forest as a real option, and Tanya nodded hard because her father used to haul hive boxes into the woods every single season. She told me her mother never followed him because the deep parts of that forest were lethal, even for battle-hardened men, and that's why her father always played it safe with his beekeeping expansion. Ash nodded along with Tanya, admitting the forest could be brutal even for experts, and he worried that if they picked it, tracking down a safe spot for the hives would turn into a nightmare. Since Ash started apprenticing under Bon, he'd been heading into the forest more and more, but Tanya didn't need to go far before she hit stretches where the trail just vanished, and Ash still remembered the panic in his chest the last time he slipped along a narrow path. Ban's crazy knowledge of the forest made Ash think he's got to know some safe spots for beekeeping, so he decided he'd grill Ban about it the next time they finally met. Tanya asked Ash if he was close to Ban, and Ash nodded like it was obvious. Ban had been a huge help to him. Then he leaned in and asked why Tanya called Ban Bonnie. Tanya's cheeks flared with a blush as she blurted, "No, Ash, that's not what you're thinking. Then she told him that Bon used to come over to her house all the time when they were kids. Ash and Micah locked eyes, and Ash went, "This feels way too convenient." Micah nodded right along. But Tanya snapped back that there was nothing else going on, no hidden meaning behind the nickname at all. Meme Ash shot her a calm look and told her not to worry, saying he got it. She and Bon were just old acquaintances, nothing more. Tanya nodded along, then added the twist back when they were younger. Ban mostly talked to her parents, not her. She told me her father always slipped into the forest, and since Bon comes from a whole line of hunters, their jobs kept pulling them into the same paths again and again. Ash caught on that this connection could be the key, so he wondered if Ban might know whether Tanya's father ever built his own hive boxes. But Tanya admitted she wasn't sure. Ash was sure calling on the band could boost their beekeeping and help Tanya too somehow. He pushed Micah to round everyone up for a meeting with Bon, and Micah nodded, saying she'd go tell her mother they needed to set it up. Yukiya, though, wasn't ready to jump into that kind of meeting yet. The story then crashed into their first face-to-face at the chief's house, Tanya meeting Ben for the first time, while Yukiya pushed them to hash everything out over dinner. Dinner rolled around, and Ash caught it right away. Tanya came into that meeting shaking with nerves, but as the minutes dragged on, her fear got replaced by steel, and she finally locked in her resolve. Eventually, Tanya shot to her feet, slipped out of the band, thanked him from the bottom of her heart for everything he'd done, and admitted she hated taking his kindness for granted, then begged for his help to chase her dream of becoming a beekeeper, just like her parents. Bon didn't even hesitate. He lit up and told them he remembered exactly where Tanya's father used to build his hive boxes, then added he'd spotted a few more strong spots deep in the forest. Ban swore he'd step in any time he wasn't tied up hunting or whenever he found a spare second during the hunt. If Tanya didn't mind, he'd be right there to help her without a second thought. Tanya kept thanking him over and over, and Bon just grinned, telling her she didn't have to thank him because he was only too happy to help. Then Yuki slipped Ash and Micah aside and whispered that she'd head off to cook dinner. She let out this huge breath of relief, grinning because it all went perfectly. Ash nodded along, agreeing, and said it was obvious Ban had been looking out for Tanya for ages, and it felt like a huge relief watching everything finally start turning the right way. With help from the band, they finally nailed down where to set the hive boxes, and suddenly their beekeeping dreams looked like they were about to explode into success. After dinner, Tanya headed home with a grin on her face, still buzzing with joy she finally got to start beekeeping, thanks to Ban. She prayed Jekyll would feel how thrilled she was, and when she finally made it home, she rushed in with an apology for keeping him waiting so late. Jekyll just rose from the dining table, waved it off, and said it was totally fine since he'd already eaten leftover wheat porridge for dinner. Then he asked how the meeting went, and Tanya told him they covered a lot and that Bon actually agreed to jump in and help with their beekeeping. Jekyll was stunned, and Tanya quickly added that he already knew how often Bon slips into the forest, which is why Bon knew exactly where her father used to place the hive boxes. Jekyll nodded, even as it all clicked into place, but he acted like none of it mattered. He told everyone he was going to bed, and the moment he lay down, he found himself staring back at the past, thinking, maybe I can do the same thing again and finally help. Micah replayed those words in her head. If she became someone strong enough to protect Ash, it would be pure good, and she'd be able to back his every move, standing shoulder to shoulder beside him. She told herself this was exactly what her mom once warned her about. Because Micah knew Ash wasn't just smart, he was always tinkering, trying wild stuff like beekeeping and whipping up aloe salve. Plus, he'd already proven he'd stand his ground and protect her from Jaglas and his own friends. Micah told her mother, if she was really meant to protect someone as incredible as Ash, she'd have to level up. Because the only way forward was hard work and getting better fast. Then she lifted a tiny wooden sword in front of her mother and boldly said she was going to ask her father to teach her real fencing because she wanted to grow stronger. Yuki could tell Micah had totally missed what she meant, so she prayed Micah would help Ash learn how to get along with others, while Micah snapped back that she'd handle that later, because right now she had to train on how to protect him with her sword. Then it hit her. She promised herself she'd go to the church earlier, and she straight up declared, I'm heading out now. As Micah was about to head out, Yuki pounced on the moment, telling her she'd start fencing lessons the very next day, and then bluntly asked if she was really planning to obsess over fencing alone, or if Micah had even been paying attention. Yuki insisted that mastering the right kind of social manners for life in the capital would help her more than any blade. Still, Micah couldn't shake the thrill of the idea of protecting. Meanwhile, Ash and Folka were huddled over a book, and Folka suddenly snapped, wait, this same character keeps showing up in a bunch of different lines. She told Ash that if they could figure out what it meant, they'd finally be able to crack the language and make real progress. He said that just forcing an interpretation never works. One sentence can make a meaning feel right, but the very next one can make the same idea sound totally off, leaving you with no real clue what the character is trying to say. Ash got Folka's point right away, then said, "Yeah, it's just a hunch. But that mark could mean more than one thing, and it might shift the moment you pair it with the right characters." Folka nodded, like, "Oh so that's why those sentences look like total gibberish?" And Ash snapped, "Yeah, that actually tracks," and said that if it was true, cracking that language would get even tougher. Folk nodded along, saying, "Sure." The Pripy-keeping book the other day, only to find nothing that could help him crack the language. Then Ash leaned in and asked, "Do you mind if I borrow your beekeeping book?" Pokey nodded, watching Ash gear up to start beekeeping, and Ash told him he'd already run the idea by Yuki, and he couldn't wait to start training, especially with spring creeping closer. Then Folk leaned in, asked what Ash was working on right now, calling out the sudden change, and even remembered how Ash had been talking just the other day about teaming up with Alo. Ash made it crystal clear, if Foko meant the aloe salve, then Yuki and the other women were the ones running its sales. He insisted he had to learn beekeeping ASAP, and swore he'd take the book with him that same day. Then Tanya and Micah showed up, knocked on the door, and Ash grinned. You couldn't have timed it better. Tanya and Micah stepped up and greeted them. And Tanya wasted no time. She told Father Folka she wanted to study there too, and she made a respectful vow. Folka then shot back, "Yeah, Tanya's coming too," so the whole crew could cram on beekeeping together. Ash. Micah and Tanya tagged along as he marched to the study area, cracked open the book, and dove straight into reading. Soon he stumbled on the info that honeybees forage for flowers within a 2-3 mile radius, and figured out that the symbol next to the numbers was probably a distance unit. Micah and Tanya were blown away by how fast Ash caught on. Micah shot back with a full apology, admitting the material was way too hard to grasp, and begged Ash to break it down. So Ash nodded, apologized for rushing ahead, then promised he'd scan the text first and start walking them through it step by step. Micah jumped on board with the plan, and Tanya even rushed in to apologize to Ash for making him teach them everything. Ash just waved it off, saying it was totally no big deal, because the second he could start learning beekeeping, he'd be thrilled to help. He admitted that while the book was packed with tons of info, some things you just can't learn by reading. You got to get your hands dirty and experience it for yourself. He said that if they ran into anything tied to real-world procedures or tools, he'd trust Tanya's expertise to guide the way, and Tanya immediately agreed to jump in and help. Next, the three of them huddled up and read side by side, soaking up the secrets of beekeeping until everything finally clicked. Because Tanya had watched her parents work with bees before, she picked it up fast every time she figured out what something new was for. Her face lit up with pure excitement and joy. Ash was sure that with Ban riding in to help, their beekeeping dream was finally about to take off in a big way. And their study sessions at the church suddenly sparked with energy, like nothing could stop them while reading. Ash lit up and said the idea of turning beehives into candles was genius, because it could give people cheap light for everyday life. Mika practically bubbled over with excitement, gushing about how delicious the honey Tanya snagged the other day was. Then Tanya leaned in and asked if she meant the honey from the wolf beehive. Mika replied, he said, "If beekeeping pays off and we can pull in a huge harvest, we'll have honey we can cook with, whip into sweets, and use for a ton of other things too." Micah lit up at the idea and said she just hoped it would actually work out. Ash shot back that if they could make goods to sell in town, their earnings would jump big time, and Tanya nodded hard, swearing she'd master beekeeping and work her tail off for the whole village. Then she jammed a finger at a particular part of the book and demanded Ash break it down for her. Ash scanned the passage and urged everyone to track when nectar and pollen flowers bloomed, because every shift in temperature could change what the bees needed, so the hive boxes had to be moved to match. He figured it meant the hive boxes had to be moved with every season, and Tanya nodded fast because her dad used to do the exact same thing back in the day. Ash said they should corner Ban and ask him next time they saw him, and Tanya instantly nodded along. Micah leaned in and grilled Tanya about her latest forest trips, then pushed her on whether the journey was really as brutal as it looked. Tanya shot back that it was genuinely rough. She had to learn how to move through the forest like it was second nature so she could handle her beekeeper duties. And that's why she'd been training with Ban, with Ash right beside them, ready to back them up. Ash didn't really mind it, but he'd be lying if he said the experience didn't feel a little intimidating. Tanya told Ash and Micah she'd only pushed into the forest's safer outer edge, but the moment they turned to head back, she'd been wiped out completely. Ash admitted that trekking through the forest was brutal, then told Tanya, "If you've got any questions, come to me or ask Ban." Tanya then blurted out that this wasn't about traveling through the forest at all. She was worried about something she just couldn't bring herself to tell Ash. She told them it all traced back to Jekyll, and Tanya couldn't hide how shocked she was. She admitted she might not want to hear about him, but she had nobody else to trust, so Ash told her it was okay and pushed her to finally open up about what was haunting her. Tanya thanked Ash, then told him the truth. Jekyll had been ignoring her lately, acting distant and lost in thought. Every time she tried to confront him, his temper flared, and he'd snap back into anger and storm off. Tanya admitted she knew she was stepping in for her parents in Jekyll's life. She could handle a piece of her mom's role, but trying to fill her father's shoes hit way harder. Ash saw it instantly. Tanya was drowning in responsibilities and crushing emotions, and she couldn't carry that weight alone. Tanya noticed Jekyll had stopped hanging out with his friends, and it lit a fire in her worries that he was cutting everyone off and burying his problems. Ash admitted that even he wrestled with emotional messes like Jekyll's, but he still vowed to help Tanya, and he knew that without her parents, she barely had anyone she could truly count on. Ash agreed right away, promising he'd nudge Jekyll to open up about what was haunting him carefully, with patience. Tanya apologized too, begging Ash not to stress himself on her account. Micah pressed Ash hard, asking if he was really sure he wanted to jump into this. Then Ash shot back that he planned to talk to Jekyll about it. Even when he admitted Jekyll might not like him, he still had to slow down his nerves and carefully figure out how to start that conversation. Right then, Jekyll sat alone out in the grassland, drowning in his thoughts. Ash strode up to him and said, "It's already dusk, aren't you heading home, Jekyll?" The moment Jekyll heard his voice, he snapped up in a flash, fury burning on his face, and demanded if Ash had come back to get revenge from their last run-in. Ash shot back that he wasn't here for that, only to sit down and talk for a while. Jekyll spun away and snapped that he had nothing to say to Ash, so Ash told him to hold up because this was about Tanya, and it couldn't wait. Jekyll hesitated, and Ash kept going, saying Tanya had looked off lately, whether she was studying beekeeping with them or sneaking into the forest with Bon. Ash pressed Jekyll hard, asking if he really didn't want his sister to be okay, then insisted he'd do whatever it took to protect her and calm her fears, and even said he was hoping Jekyll might have a clue that would finally explain what the heck was going on. Jekyll's rage erupted as he snapped at Ash to shut up, screaming that Ash was the last person he ever wanted to talk to. When Ash snapped that this had everything to do with Tanya, Jekyll erupted, saying right then and there, that was the whole problem. He tore into Ash for always trying to cozy up to everyone, like he needed their approval to matter, and then Jekyll fired off. He was disgusted by Ash's act, snapped at him to quit playing helpful, and told him to stay out of everyone's business. Then he came barreling at Ash, spitting accusations that he couldn't possibly understand how much Tanya had suffered. Jekyll offered it up, and then he shoved Ash hard to the ground and snatched, yanked him by the collar and spat out his fury, calling Ash arrogant for what he'd just seen. Rage in his chest turned into arrogance, he snapped, saying that Ash learning to read and write and making medicine somehow meant. He cracked open the beekeeping book and studied it hard, and still, it didn't make him any more special than he was before. Check. Jekyll shot back, demanding to know why those tiny wins were all it took for Ash's nonstop praise, and demanded to know why Tanya leaned on him so heavily. Tears choking him, Jekyll demanded to know why Ash could ace everything while he could barely keep his own sister afloat, and he confessed he'd been obsessing over ways to help Tanya, because in the end, he'd always been the one who stayed closest to her. Tears poured down his face as Jekyll just couldn't find a way to help her, while Ash seemed to nail every single thing he attempted. Ash shot back that he couldn't ace everything, and told him that whenever he couldn't pull something off by himself, he'd always leaned on other people to get it done. He confessed he'd been wondering if he could ever calm Tanya's fears on his own, so he rushed to Jekyll for help. Ash didn't ask for sympathy. He said being hated didn't bother him, but he still pushed for Jekyll's help, begging him to back Tanya at least this once. Jekyll finally blinked awake and rubbed his eyes as the two of them sat shoulder to shoulder. Then, after a beat, he finally opened his mouth and said, "Back when their parents were still alive, he and Tanya used to slog through the fields together just to scrape by and keep food on the table. They never had enough for anything beyond the bare essentials, but somehow they pushed through anyway, and no matter how brutal life got, they clung to each other and made it work." Jekyll said it all clicked the moment he saw Tanya clutched around a book, tears spilling down her face, saying he finally clocked just how badly she wanted to dive into beekeeping. Right then, it hit him. Tanya had been swallowing her own wishes in silence so he wouldn't be scared, all while she kept raising him through every brutal day, and suddenly he saw. He'd started to feel like dead weight to her, like he was only burdening his sister, and now he knew just how wrong and foolish he'd been to think they were really helping each other. He was totally clueless about beekeeping, And even the book in front of him might as well have been written in another language. He couldn't read a word. All he knew was farm work, and it crushed him because he couldn't do a damn thing to back her dreams. Jekyll then finally broke down and admitted that he'd just noticed Tanya closing in on Ban, and it instantly terrified him, because what if she ended up marrying him? He confessed that the fear had been crushing his heart and leaving him deeply. Ash pushed, asking if Jekyll's sadness really came from Tanya getting closer to Ban, so Jekyll shook his head and admitted the truth. The real weight crushing him was guilt. Tanya had never cared about romance before, and he was certain this mess was his fault. He claimed Tanya had always put him before herself, and he figured everyone had tried to get close to her back then only for her to shut them down every time, all because she worried for him. Jekyll then admitted the truth. He actually liked Ban, even if Ban could be a pain to talk to sometimes. Ash admitted Ban's not exactly a smooth talker, and Jekyll shot back that Ban keeps to himself even more still. He said he'd only trust his sister to someone he knew he could count on. Jekyll told Tanya he had to push her toward Ban, because deep down he truly believed Ban was a genuinely good person. He admitted it hurt to watch Tanya chase her happiness, because he felt like he was always blocking her path, and he hated himself for it. He told her to forget him, marry Ban, and build a real, fulfilling life as a beekeeper. Right then, Jekyll admitted the scary truth: if Tanya ever walked out the door, he wouldn't have a clue what to do or where to go. He felt boxed in, stuck in place, and even confessed he couldn't find the words to tell her how trapped he felt, even knowing his silence only piled on her worries. Ash finally clocked how wrecked Jekyll really was, and how that inner war was hitting Tanya too. Then, while he wrestled with what he could do, Ash realized Jekyll didn't just need answers. He needed a clear direction, a compass to help him carve out his own path. After making up his mind, Ash leaned in and told Jekyll he had the answer. He could land him a real job, the kind that would finally calm Tanya's worries too. Jekyll leaned in and demanded to know what the job was really like. He was dying to understand. Then, Ash told him he was lucky, because a tradesman down the street was on the hunt for an apprentice right now. Jekyll went pale at the news and demanded, "Can this really be true?" And Ash swore he heard it straight from the guy's own mouth. So short-staffed he didn't even hesitate. He opened up his whole trade to a fresh apprentice, then flooded with relief like a dam finally breaking. "Chief." Jekyll snapped his hands together and begged Ash to introduce him to the tradesman, swearing he'd do whatever it took. No matter how tiny or brutal the task was, Ash agreed, then promised he'd ask the man to come visit Jekyll on a day he was free. Jekyll accepted, grateful, and admitted he never had a shot against Ash, apologizing for how he'd acted. Ash brushed it off, saying the request would be easy, and he didn't hold. Jekyll snapped that his apology wasn't just for that moment. It covered how he acted in the woods too. Admitting his rage came from feeling useless when Ash steamrolled everything, and even got praised for it. Feeling completely lost and crushed, Jekyll started treating Ash like a threat, and when the fear hit, he snapped and lashed out. Still, deep down, he knew Ash had never exposed him or embarrassed him. Jekyll dropped to his knees before Ash and poured out a deep, heartfelt apology. Ash took it and told him, "Don't sweat it," then made it clear he'd never once taken Jekyll's moves personally. He thrust his hand out, and the two of them clasped it tight, sealing their reconciliation on the spot. Jekyll hit the brakes in total shock when he realized the tradesman was banned. Then he bolted after Ash, yelling that Ash should have said that huge detail from the very start. Jekyll broke down how Van blindsided him by suddenly ordering him to work under him, and Ash shot back that Jekyll had already agreed to the apprenticeship without even knowing who the tradesman was. Then he urged Jekyll to tag along with them for study sessions at the church, swearing that mastering beekeeping the right way would let him support Tanya even more. Still rattled, Jekyll snapped that there was no way he could cram all of that, and admitted he'd nearly wanted to clock Ash in sheer frustration until Ash stayed calm and told him to chill, promising that with real study and effort, violence wouldn't be on the menu. Jekyll wasted no time. He dove into Ban's apprenticeship, mastering the basics of hunting wild game and jumping into beekeeping duties right alongside him. As the days rolled on, relief hit him hard. Tanya's worries were finally getting confronted. One day, Ban, Ash, Tanya, and Jekyll charged into the forest together, and Jekyll barked at Tanya to watch her step, or pay for it. Tanya thanked him for worrying about her, and Ash pointed out just how rock-solid Jekyll had become. Jekyll shot back with full confidence, promising he'd handle every last thing. Ever since Jekyll got tapped to become Ban's apprentice, Ash watched him throw himself into the hunt with zero distractions. While he trained, Jekyll also learned to read and write at the church, and even studied the basics of beekeeping. He owned the whole rock-throwing disaster, then showed up and apologized to Ash and Tanya. No excuses, no dodging. Even as he shows up at Ash's doorstep in person, ready to beg for forgiveness and make it right then and there. By then, Tanya had been steadily sharpening her beekeeping plans, while Yukiya's aloe salve operation kept booming under his steady hands. Ash pulled in steady coin from selling his salves, and that money kept his experiments stocked pens, paper, and even firewood, so his research finally started running at full speed. He chased his next breakthrough. His latest win was crafting test batches of salves and candles from materials pulled straight from beehives, and, with winter creeping closer, he also threw himself into a whole new research project that mattered just as much. Whenever a season rolled around, it tore lives out of the villagers, and Ash couldn't stop thinking about his past. He remembered Noskula, where food and medicine were so scarce that even a common cold could turn fatal, because nobody had the treatment to stop the illness. And because of that, some villagers would get wrecked by brutal high fevers, lose their appetite, and slowly rot in pain until death-winter tragedies that hit every year. And the moment the season started creeping in, Ash couldn't stop reliving his past. Especially those days he spent at home with his mother. He still remembered the moment TL showed up to pick him up, and how his mother welcomed the boy with open arms. After they traded a few warm pleasantries, Ash leaned in and told her he was heading out to play with Tyler, and that he'd be back later. She smiled at both of them and wished them a great time, and Ash still remembered how he and Tila had laughed, played, and soaked up every second with their friends. After a while, Tila just snapped, collapsed onto the ground, lay there, and complained that he suddenly felt way too hot. But Ash figured it was just Tila burning herself out, because right after, their stomachs started growling like crazy, and Tila blurted out that he was starving and could really use some food. Ash sat there, quiet and crushed, while Tyel leaned in and told him, "Don't worry." Tyel urged them to pray to the monkey god for a bountiful harvest, then reminded Ash that his dad was out in the forest working his heart out, so food was coming. Ash then shot a warning winter's creeping in, so they needed to head home early. Tila begged it wouldn't get too cold, said he'd head home for now, but would swing back later to play, and Ash promised he'd be right there waiting then. Tila warned he'd be gone for a while, and told Ash not to cry over missing him, and Ash swore he wouldn't cry. After Tila slipped away, Ash finally got a moment to breathe at home. Then his mom showed up and pulled him aside to talk about Tila. Ash leaned in and demanded to know if Thiel was finally getting better, because he'd looked totally fine just the other day. Once he got better, they promised they'd play again. Then he leaned in and asked if he could visit Tila the very next day. Noticing his mother looked drained, Ash leaned in and demanded, "What's wrong?" She whispered softly to him that Tila could never play with him again because he was gone. Ash froze in shock and blurted, "How could this happen?" Then his mom, Sheila, yanked him into a tight hug and told him the truth. Thiel had caught a cold that never truly got better. Ash still wouldn't believe it, swearing it couldn't possibly be true. Yeah, Sheila told her that Tila's condition kept spiraling, the cold turning into a fever that refused to break until it finally stole his life. She didn't know how to comfort Ash, but she grabbed his hands and told him to stay brave, because losses like this could hit again someday. Ash demanded to know why it had to repeat in the future, and if a cold really was hopelessly incurable. Sheila shot back that it wasn't the kind of sickness you could just fix, at least, not in their little village. Later, Ash stood before the Lay's grave, totally frozen inside while rain hammered down all around him. He stared into the past, thinking about all the people he'd known who'd walked right into the same kind of doom, and couldn't stop asking why life had turned so brutal and deadly. He couldn't shake the question why, of all days, he'd failed to save a single soul. Right then, Sheila burst in, yelling Ash's name and demanding why he was standing out there in the freezing cold. With the whole world holding its breath, she blurted, "Are you okay?" Ash hurriedly apologized, admitting he didn't make it home on time. Sheila, already crying, wrapped him up in a tight hug and told him, "It's okay," then leaned in close and kept repeating that he's a good boy and these things happen in life, so he better stop blaming himself. Ash shoved those brutal memories to the back of his mind and threw himself into his writing instead. He could only hope things had finally changed, because if his research paid off, they'd survive winter this time, safer than ever before. Back then, Ash was grinding away at a fever-stopper medicine brewed from what looked like willow bark, the kind people had used since ancient times to cut fevers, ease pain, and calm inflammation, and with winter creeping closer by the day, he barely had time to double-check everything, so pressure slammed him to push it into real-world use fast. Even if it barely cut the death toll from the cold, he still swore the fight was worth it. One day, Ash finally surged forward like the finish line for his fever reducer was right there. Yet he knew that sipping willow bark broth could trigger rare dangerous reactions if the conditions were just right. Even though the botany guide never warned about these symptoms, and his experiments so far hadn't turned up any dangerous side effects, he finally snapped too. His sloppy lack of real research had made him reckless. Even after testing the medicine on marmots and, crazily, on himself without a single mishap, Ash refused to hand it out yet. He knew something was setting off those terrifying reactions, and he wasn't stopping until he figured out the trigger. Then he decided to hunt for safer alternative ingredients to get the solution right. Suddenly, Ash's mother burst into the room with devastating news, whispering that Micah had collapsed from a brutal fever. She told us Micah was barely hanging on, unresponsive to anyone calling her name, and her temperature kept skyrocketing by the second. At this rate, she worried that Micah wouldn't make it unless someone acted right now. Ash's eyes snapped straight to the medicine he'd already set aside. He knew it could bring a fever down, but he didn't have time to figure out what could trigger those rare and deadly symptoms. There was zero time to plan a backup treatment, and hesitation was never on the table. He snapped to the truth and knew he had to move right now. He couldn't shake the memories he shared with Micah and the thought of her suffering the same fate as Tila crushed him. Ash gripped that life-saving medicine like it was his last shot, and panic thundered in his chest as he bolted out of the house, telling his mother he was heading straight to Micah's home. As he sprinted through the village, Ash clenched his resolve he wouldn't let her go. He clung to the hope that this medicine would finally work, and that this time, unlike the last, he'd actually be able to save someone. The scene cut to Micah, fighting for every breath as brutal waves of heat and cold slammed through her body, feelings she hated with her whole soul. Her arms felt like they were made of stone, fear crushing her thoughts as she begged silently for someone to rescue her. And right then, Ash's voice cut through the panic, asking if she was okay. Micah slumped weakly on her bed, listening as he talked to her parents, and her stomach twisted with one burning question. Why was he even here? In the blur, she caught Ash talking, debating whether he should give her a certain medicine. Then he hurried to explain it to the village chief, saying it had shockingly powerful power to knock down even the worst fever. He even admitted there's a rare chance this could trigger nasty side effects. That's when Micah realized the medicine might crush her fever, then turn around and make everything worse. And that's exactly why they were stuck hesitating. Even though the idea of taking that medicine scared her to death, Micah knew her condition was already becoming the real nightmare, because refusing treatment would only let it spiral downhill. The thought of suffering even more, losing time with Ash, or worse, watching the last of her days slip away, hit her like pure dread. Micah then heard Ash say that the second he found out she'd collapsed, he knew he couldn't wait a second. He swallowed his pride and apologized for the confusion around the medicine, but he made one thing crystal clear. He only wanted her to live. Determined as steel, Micah stormed out of her room and declared, loud and clear, that she'd take the medicine. Yukiya immediately blocked her from moving, snapping that pacing around could make things worse and she needed rest right now. Then Micah stepped in, reassured him, and said she'd overheard their talk. If Ash made that medicine, it had to work. She snapped everyone to move faster, then confessed she couldn't wait to keep studying and work side by side with Ash. Even with Yukiya still wavering, Mika cut through the hesitation and swore she'd take the medicine no matter what happened. Yukiya spun toward Klein, begging for his call, then, locking eyes with Micah's unshakable stare. Klein nodded and insisted they honor her decision. He softly rested his hand on her head, urged her to take the medicine, and promised she'd get better fast. Klein leaned in and fired a quick question at Ash. Is everything set up and ready? Ash nodded and said he'd keep a close eye on Micah's condition, then give the medicine in tiny, careful doses to protect her, no matter what. Micah shouted to Ash, promising him she'd bounce back soon. Ash silently begged that the medicine would work, anything, just let Micah survive. A few days later, Ash showed up at the chief's place and immediately apologized for barging in, unannounced. And Micah swung the door open, inviting him inside where she was lying in bed. Ash demanded to know if Micah was strong enough to sit up, and Micah shot back that she was fine, then explained how brutally high her fever had been, until Ash's medicine pulled her back to feeling okay. Feeling fine at last, Ash finally exhaled and handed her a glass of water Yukiya had just prepared. Micah thanked him, took another sip, and said the water tasted amazing. She actually loved it. Ash lit up at her reaction and told her the drink had salt and honey blended in, because both hit the spot for her body. Micah thanked him again, and Ash waved it off, saying it truly hadn't been a bother, because he was just thrilled she'd enjoyed every bit of it. Micah softened his voice and urged her to get some rest, and when she finally lay back, she immediately asked if Ash was planning to split. Ash thought it over for a moment, then offered to stay and chat with her for as long as she wanted, saying he'd just made huge breakthroughs with his beehive experiments. The second Micah heard that, her eyes lit up and she blurted out, "Okay, what kind of progress did you make?" Ash grinned and said, "First things first, I've already managed to make candles and salves. Then he sighed, because the real truth hit hard. He still had to dig deeper and test how aloe salve reacts with everything else he's mixing. Micah couldn't help but gush that Ash was seriously impressive. Then Ash shrugged and told him, "Yeah, most of my progress came from this beekeeping book, because it laid out the whole manufacturing process in crisp, step-by-step detail." He also told her he'd pushed his fever medicine even further, plus he'd found a medicinal herb that seemed safer than the willow bark he'd given her earlier, and now he was testing it. Micah just stared in shock, because she'd never even known something like that existed. Then he asked, "So what do you do next?" And Ash swallowed the moment and apologized for everything that went down before. He confessed that his lack of research let her take medicine loaded with unnecessary risks, and admitted that if he'd spotted the risk factors sooner, he could have given her a far safer treatment. Micah quickly told Ash she didn't need to apologize, and Ash realized she wouldn't feel any better right now if he hadn't sprinted over to bring her the medicine. And because of that, she genuinely breathed a sigh of relief. Then she leaned in and asked how his new fever reducer tests were going. Ash said it was all running smoothly, and he was even praying he'd have the medicine fully ready before winter slammed the door. He told me he'd already talked it over with Yukiya. She was planning to stockpile fever reducers and food at her place, so if anyone got sick, they'd have what they needed right away. Micah demanded to know how the distribution would work, and Ash shot back that the setup was built to spare the village, because loading up every household with enough food and medicine was brutal, pricey, and nearly impossible. So Yukiya would store the supplies. With a traveling peddler gone, villagers could finally grab what they needed on their own, no more waiting around. Miller Micah snapped that if people could get medicine and every other must-have straight from Yukiya, then anyone who caught a cold wouldn't have so much to fear. And Ash nodded like, "Yeah, that's the whole point of this plan." He told them straight up that now his mission was to churn out enough fever reducers to make sure every single person in the village got a fair share. Finally, Ash snapped that he couldn't stick around a second longer. Ash warned Micah to slow down, stop burning herself out, and get some real rest. Micah nodded, thanked him from the bottom of her heart, and took the advice. Then Ash brought up the beehive salve and straight up asked if she'd help him test it sometime later. Micah agreed without hesitation, and Ash practically lit up with gratitude, telling her to put all her energy into getting fully healed first. Micah promised she'd push through that cold as fast as her body could handle. Ash finally tore himself away from the house with Yukiya, apologizing for keeping them waiting way too long. But Yukiya brushed it off and instead gave Ash a heartfelt thank you for how much he'd helped Micah. Ash leaned in and reassured her, saying he'd put the fever reducer through intense testing, and then he promised he'd rush it to her the moment it was ready. Yukiya lit up and praised his hard work, because thanks to Ban and Jekyllin, the money hauled in from that aloe salve, everyone in the village was finally eating well, with food to spare and even extra funds left over. She bowed and thanked Ash for the village chief's household, praising how his efforts had them set for the winter ahead. Then Ash shot back that the thanks didn't belong to him at all, because Yukiya and the villagers who backed him through it all deserved the credit. Yukiya said they'd always braced for winter losses, but she couldn't shake the gut feeling that this year was going to hit different. Ash nodded at her words and swore to push even harder, determined to make sure everyone survived the winter safe and sound. He prayed that when spring finally burst through the sky, they'd welcome it side by side, everyone in the village still alive and breathing. As Ash walked away, he couldn't help but think about Yukiya's unstoppable optimism. Even with his confidence blazing, he couldn't shake the truth he'd given Micah medicine that might have been dangerous. And he still couldn't find a single clue or record about the brutal symptoms he'd been terrified of. He finally got it. Inside the village, his reach had hard limits, not just in medicine, but in every bit of knowledge he was trying to chase. That safe, comfy life he'd been dreaming of still felt miles away, like it never wanted to reach him. But Ash knew one day he'd have to break away from the village, maybe heading straight for the capital, so he could get his hands on more books, unlock deeper knowledge, and find the better tools he needed. For now, he decided to stick with what he had and train his plan hard for the day he'd get back home. Ash walked up, greeted his mother, and then in. Ash ran straight into his father, David, drunk, loud, and furious, and David ripped into him, yelling that all Ash ever did was hide in books and waste his time. He shoved books aside and barked that he should be out in the fields, not wasting time. David would always say this: "If you were born into a farming family, your worth wasn't words or title. It was the brutal hours you threw into the fields." He was convinced that real respect is forged by dedication, a warm smile, and a rock-solid work ethic, because that's what lets a man earn a living and take care of his family. But Ash wasn't like the others. While everyone slaved over the fields, he shoved through his chores fast, then dove into his books like they were his real destiny. Even after David warned Ash again and again that ignoring the fields would ruin their harvest, Ash stayed glued to his studies, refusing to look away. Before David could even blink, Ash was already wrapping himself into the village chief's family, pushing his own ideas, brewing beer, and mixing medicine anything to keep him far from farm labor. Even though David praised Ash's insane achievements and knew studying was brutal, he still couldn't shake the conflict in his chest. Sheila, of course, kept flashing that proud smile and bragging that Ash was their pride and joy. And David matched her pride but still couldn't shake the feeling that Ash needed to spend more time out in the fields. Later, over beers with his buddies, David boldly declared that farm work mattered way more than schooling for a farmer's kid. Moore said it, and one friend backed him up. Ash helped out in the fields, sure, but his real obsession was academics. Then another friend stepped in fast, insisting Ash wasn't dodging any work and that David was just stressing over nothing. Then the first friend shrugged and said David's worry might just be because Ash is so insanely smart he can't fit the usual mold, while the third guy teased, "Come on, you really think Ash is David's kid?" Rattled by that comment, David snapped and launched into a furious attack on him. The man shot out an immediate apology, claiming he'd only been joking, and he also said Sheila never gave up on David, even when everyone else did. Then one of their friends tried to break the tension by pushing David to drink more. David chugged his cup in one gulp and bellowed for everyone to shut up. When he finally stumbled back home, David dropped right where he stood, head hanging low, and Sheila demanded to know how much he'd had to drink, but he was so drunk he couldn't get the words out right. Sheila snapped at him to hurry up and get ready, warning him that she still had a whole stack of tasks left to finish. David nodded, then lifted his head and froze when he realized Ash still hadn't come home. Right then, he made up his mind. The second Ash walked in, David was going to set the rules as his father and hit him with a stern talking to that would stick. When Ash finally showed up, David snapped that Ash should get to work in the fields right now and quit wasting time on books. Ash's gloomy face killed the vibe and David's irritation flared, so he snapped, "Sit down." Ash obeyed, and David thundered that boys were built to work the fields. Ash didn't argue, he just nodded and admitted that farming really was a man's duty. He admitted that the lessons from books, especially about managing work and perfecting growing conditions, somehow made the field work way easier. David erupted, yelling that Ash was acting foolish, insisting that the more you poured time and effort into the fields, the better the results would come. Yet Ash stayed cool, saying he'd been recording the field's output and that to grow a better harvest, you had to closely watch the farmland itself. David dropped his gaze again, stuck there wondering why Ash had to be so ridiculously smart. In that moment, it hit him hard he wasn't a good husband or a real father, and he dropped the ball on every responsibility as a parent. Even with all those flaws, he could still see it. Ash had truly grown into a fine young man. He was far wiser than David ever was, and he always treated Sheila with real thoughtfulness and genuine care. David felt torn as he tried to lecture Ash, even though he knew his own flaws were just as real. Eventually, he shot up from his seat and demanded Ash prove whether he really was his son. Ash didn't even flinch, saying that whatever anyone tried to claim, he was unmistakably David's. Then he added that if that weren't true, he wouldn't be able to read David's drunken, slurred words so clearly. David couldn't believe it. He asked straight if Ash was serious, and Ash nodded hard, explaining he'd grown up watching David from afar. He admitted that downing drinks to prove strength isn't exactly admirable, but even so, David showed his grit his own way. David swallowed the truth, because Ash had watched his father's flaws up close and still went on to become the kind of son everyone can look up to. Seeing Ash's character lit a fire in him, he promised himself he'd become a better father, starting now. Then Sheila stepped up to Ash and thanked him for bearing his father's words so patiently, because David, she said, showed his love in his own way. When people praised Ash, David's pride and joy would flood him every single time. Yeah. Sheila turns to Ash and begs him to keep quiet about their talk, and Ash nods, swearing he'll hold every word to himself. As the days dragged on, spring finally burst onto the scene. It rolls in like clockwork, the yearly spring tiding festival. And it's meant to blast fresh joy through the whole village before everyone marches back to the fields. That year, the festival crackled with energy. Every villager had survived the brutal winter without losing a single life. Ash couldn't help but grin at his win. And right then David slid up to him, saying the place felt downright celebratory because most villagers were already smashed. Ash leaned in and asked David if he'd been drinking way less this year. David nodded and admitted that he had to start taking fatherhood way more seriously because from here on out, his choices mattered. Ash fired back that he was proud to be the respectable man's son, and when David heard it, he straightened up just a bit, pride swelling in his chest. Ash then insisted cutting David's alcohol down would probably do wonders for his health. He confessed he wasn't strong yet, and that's why he felt real relief, because his father was solid enough to count on. David burst out laughing and said Ash wasn't ready to beat him just yet, but he promised one thing. When Ash needed help, David would be there. After that, Ash finally brought it up. He told David he had a favor to ask, right as David was questioning what it was. Ash leaned in and told David that Tanya had started beer brewing, so her fields were sitting unused now then. Ash suggested they split the core and asked if David and he could manage those plots together. Ash even admitted he had an experiment he couldn't wait to try, and David brushed it off, saying it was no big deal at all and those extra fields wouldn't trouble them one bit. Ash lit up, pleased by the agreement, and offered to jump in and help with the additional, extra work. David just shot Ash a shake of the head, waved off the panic, and told him not to overthink it and handle Tanya's fields himself, and Ash finally exhaled with relief, grateful he could always count on his father. A few days after David took over those fields, Ash tore into his brand new experiment with full focus. Right then, he turned the page. In the garden with Micah, Ash asked him if she was doing well, and when he nodded along, she lit up. She said she was flying through her book, then pointed out exactly what section Micah should tackle next. After she nodded that she understood, he thanked Micah for helping with the experiment, then Micah brushed it off, saying it was the least she could do because Ash had stepped in for her when she was sick. She pressed her. Was this experiment really that important? Ash nodded and said, if everything hit right, the harvest would skyrocket. And those flowers weren't just for show. They were meant to heal and strengthen the whole field. He admitted he'd first tossed the whole idea aside because their own fields had no room. But then his father backed him, so he finally got the chance to try. He also said he'd spotted Micah's hands glowing, and he called out that the beehive setup was clearly doing its job. Micah nodded right away, saying that was probably why her skin had turned smooth and healthy. Ash said there didn't seem to be any downside, so they should go ahead and sell it once they'd secured a steady supply. Why? Micah still had hope that Tanya's beer brewing would finally click, because he could see how hard she'd been working on it. Then Ash cut in, grinning. Tanya's journey isn't over yet. He was done. And he noticed how, even after all her prep, she still crashed into one problem after another when she tried to turn her plans into action. Micah nodded and admitted the same truth. No matter how much you study, using it in the real world is still brutally hard. Ash admitted it would be rough, then said these trials were something all of them had to face to really get it before he muttered that he might check on Tanya later. Micah perked up and asked if she could tag along, promising she'd help however she could. Ash pressed her, asking if she was really sure, and confessed he'd feel guilty if he kept leaning on her for help. Micah insisted that Ash had done so much more for her than she ever managed to do for him. And she added that her mother couldn't stop talking about how much Ash had powered the village forward with his aloe salve work, his beekeeping, and even the fever reducer, and that he'd genuinely left a mark for the better. Ash snapped back that he was giving her too much credit, then insisted none of it was possible without help, and that he'd had a whole crew in his corner the entire time. He acknowledged. He admitted his actions helped the village, but he couldn't hide the truth his real drive was chasing his own dreams. So yeah, his motives weren't fully selfless. He made it crystal clear, thank everyone who backed you. If you ignore their support, arrogance creeps in. And that's how failure finally hits. Then he poured out his gratitude to Micah for standing by him every step of the way. Only for Micah to wave it off right away and tell him he didn't owe her a thing. She promised she'd do her best to keep up, and Ash snapped back that if she truly meant it, he'd have to push himself even harder to deserve her effort. And then he added, he wanted to keep pushing things forward for everyone. Then the emergency bell ripped through the village like a warning siren, and Ash watched villagers sprint by in terror, and one man blurted, "Has anyone been attacked?" The other man shook his head and admitted he didn't know, because with everything going wrong, they felt completely helpless to handle it alone. Ash blurted, "What's going on?" And the man snapped, urgently ordering them to run, saying the village had turned unsafe because a bear had crashed into the area, and Ash and Micah just froze in shock at that news. Ash knew bears could snack on plants or hunt animals, but he'd also heard the terrifying rumor, once a bear tasted human flesh, it wouldn't want anything else again. If that monster ever tore into a village, everything would collapse in pure, devastating chaos. But the worst part was this: those who could handle the threat weren't even around. Village Chief Klein was stuck in the capital, away from the danger, and Ban and Jekyll, fresh from hunting, had slipped into the forest, vanishing for days with no word of when they'd come back. Ash finally figured out the hard truth: he was the only hunter in that whole village with the skills to take down a bear. He urged Micah to run to the church with the others, then told him he had one urgent thing to handle first before he sprinted in to join them. Micah, visibly shaking, blurted out that it was too dangerous for him to go alone, and begged to go with him. Ash said it flat out he refused to let her stay behind, begging her to rush to the church and tell everyone he'd swing by his place first before joining them, because he couldn't have a single person thinking he vanished. Micah hissed that the rule hit everyone. When that emergency bell rang, they all had to sprint to the church. And she begged him to go too. Ash stayed cool, steadied her nerves, and promised her he'd be fine. He promised he'd be at the church in no time. Then he laid a hand on her shoulder, demanded she relay his message to the others, and handed her the responsibility. With her heart pounding, Micah begged Ash to promise he'd come back safe, and Ash swore he would. Then he tore off toward his house at full speed. When he finally burst through the door, he found his parents already gone, sheltering at the church. He snapped to the realization that every second mattered, grabbed 2 spears, a bow, several arrows, and a handful of small hunting tools straight from his quiver, and got ready to move fast. He meant to scare the bear off before it got anywhere near the church. With his gear locked and loaded, Ash tore back toward the village. As he closed in, a thunderous roar crashed through the air, and there, right in front of him, stood the bear. He suddenly clocked that hibernation was over and that the animal was probably tearing through the woods, desperate to find food. The moment their eyes locked, Ash got it this bear wasn't hunting for trouble. It was just stalking a meal. He figured letting that bear creep any closer to the church was asking for disaster. So after a quick flash of thought, he chose the bold move, face it head on. Keep his voice steady and friendly, and let the bear know the village sees it. Then he tried to talk it down, hoping a hungry bear would take food instead of sparking a fight. Ash watched the bear stay on edge, snapping its head around and hunting for any other danger in the shadows. He kept talking, telling the bear it could gulp down its hunger without hurting a soul. Then he slipped back into the forest, convinced this choice would keep both sides winning. The bear erupted with a thunderous roar that shook the whole place. So Ash couldn't shake the fear that he might not be able to pull this off. Yet he knew there was no backing down, because that bear was not about to walk away peacefully. Ash clenched his fists and swore he'd never stand by while it tore the village apart. He felt this place was more than scenery. It was the heartbeat of his dreams, the launchpad for everything he wanted next. And he was sure that if he ever told his story, this village would be only the first spark of something massive. Ash stepped up to the bear and warned it. If it came to tear the village apart, he'd have no choice but to fight back. He blurted out, loud and fearless, that he was the bear's worst enemy. When the bear lunged into the chase, Ash ditched the spears and sprinted away just to keep that distance. Instead of leaning on his bow and arrows, he decided to protect the village a whole different way. He loosed an arrow at the bear, and it only scraped that thick hide instead of driving in. Charged straight at him with brutal force, and Ash had to scramble back and retreat. But as the creature shot forward to strike again, Ash caught a tiny, eerie glint flashing across its claws. And right away, he realized this was the paralytic poison the band family had slipped him for hunting. He prayed that the poison would cripple the bear's peso. Ash moved like lightning, smeared it onto his spear, and locked in for the next brutal strike. The bear lunged again, and Ash snapped into motion, dodging it clean and driving the spear straight into its side. The contact hit instantly, then the bear snapped back and struck hard, sending everything flying. It snapped the spear in two, raked Ash's hand with its claws, and then backed off just a little. Poison's Ash grimaced hard as the poison finally started to bite. He knew he had to stop that bleeding right now, before it got any worse. As the bear barreled forward, Ash figured he'd only got a few minutes before the poison's power wore off. Ash clung to hope he could last that long. Then he shouted at the bear, because both of them were hurt and neither of them could even use their right arms. So he argued the only fair call was to mark the fight as a draw. The bear snapped back with a thunderous roar, then charged again like it was daring anyone to stop it. Cornered with no choice, Ash snatched a nearby stick and slammed it toward the bear's head. Then he snatched back what was left of his spear and braced for round two. While Ash felt the truth hit hard, he might not survive much longer. Still, he gritted his teeth, planted his feet, and braced himself for the bear's next furious charge. Fear slammed into him so hard it turned his blood cold, and he instantly knew the odds were stacked against him. Still, he figured the bear had to be just as terrified because it barreled straight at the tip of that deadly spear, and suddenly the fight wasn't just a showdown, it was a nerve-wracking gamble where either one could drop. Ash couldn't deny its courage. In the wild, that kind of predator has survived a lifetime of dangers. Yet he was sure of one thing. Death had never truly managed to claim it. His mind snapped back to the feeling of dying so vivid it cut through even the blurry haze of his old life right down to the stuttering thump of his heart. His vision dimming inch by inch, and the wind roaring all by itself, untethered from the noise of a living body as his consciousness slipped away. Ash refused to drown in that memory. He grabbed it like a lifeline, turning his fear of dying into iron resolve that pushed back the terror trying to freeze him in place. Right when the bear lunged again, it suddenly froze in place. Ash felt the fear finally hit the creature, and before it could recover, he yanked the spear forward and drove it in again. Again, the bear's jaws lunged toward him, but at the last second, its power snapped. Then that huge body crumpled straight to the ground. Ash dropped to a stop, utterly spent, and finally let out a long, heavy breath like the fight had drained every last bit of him. He stood there, quietly soaking in the victory he'd bled for. Then he checked his condition. He finally realized his injuries were brutal, and the blood was still pouring out like it hadn't stopped. He knew he had to slam the bleeding to a stop right away, and even with pain raging through his body, Ash clenched his teeth and refused to quit. He still had a mountain of dreams left to chase. Goals he hadn't even touched yet, so, with pure grit burning in his chest, he vowed to himself that he would survive. As the villagers finally wrapped up their evacuation and slammed the church doors shut behind them, Micah's worry for Ash only kept swelling. David closed in, demanded, "Is Ash with you?" And Mike just stared, caught between the question and the truth. Micah shot back that Ash told her he'd swing by his place first, then come right back to the church. Moments later, a sudden crash ripped through the air and jolted everyone to attention. And it didn't take long before they realized staying there was downright dangerous. Micah snapped into panic, lunged for the door, and demanded they open it right now. One of the men grabbed her mid-step and snapped that Ash still hadn't come back. Then when Micah tried to slip outside, he blocked her, warned that it was too dangerous, and told her to stay put while he went to look. Even after Micah's warning, she charged ahead anyway, while the others begged her to stop and wait. As she pushed forward, she stumbled on a dead bear, and right beside it, Ash lay sprawled on the ground. Seeing him like that snapped terror through her, and the others scrambled right after her. David grabbed Sheila's attention and asked if she'd seen Ash. Then he didn't even wait. He bolted straight to Ash and begged him, "Don't you dare give up." Sheila was left staring at the chaos in stunned disbelief, asking herself how the hell something like this could have happened. She whipped around to Yukiya and demanded what to do next. And Yukiya snapped that they had to hit first aid right now to stop the bleeding, because even after Ash had tried to apply a tourniquet himself, the blood still hadn't fully stopped. As they clawed at every option to help him, all they could think was that Klein needed to be there, because only he could steer them through this nightmare. Micah was left reeling in shock, staring at Ash's wrecked state, unable to wrap his head around how he'd gotten this close to dying. Then everyone started whispering speculations. Was that bear really real? Was it really dead? And did Ash actually get the final hit that took it down? Despite their questions, everyone's faces screamed the same fear. Ash was bleeding badly, and his condition kept spiraling worse by the second. Micah was terrified if the bleeding kept pouring out like that. Ash wouldn't make it, and panic hit her so hard she couldn't even think of a single thing she could do to save him. The idea of losing him, never hearing his voice again, never studying side by side crushed her, and in that suffocating despair, she suddenly remembered Ash's old instructions about how to treat injuries. Micah snapped to the realization that she already had everything she needed. She'd been here before. She remembered how Ash had nursed her through that fever, and suddenly it hit. Now it was her turn to step up and help him. She clutched her courage and blurted out that they had to start first aid right away. She told David and Sheila to haul the Ash to her house, then snapped at the nearby villagers to rush her hot water as fast as they could. Tanya stepped up fast, offered her help, and said Bon had taught her the basics of first aid. Then she dashed into the forest to grab everything they'd need. At the same time, Polka snatched the book Ash used to learn medical treatment, praying it had the right way to heal his wounds. Yukiya then leaned in and told Micah to think hard. Maybe someone else could still step in and help. She offered to help right away, promised Micah she'd talk to everyone still at the church about what happened, then would race in to join them the second she could. With pure determination surging through him, Micah barked at everyone to hurry up and race straight to her house, no delays. As soon as they got back to her place, Micah and the crew rushed to Ash and started slamming on first aid right away. Once the bandages were finally in place, Tanya leaned in and said the treatment should keep his condition steady. Boca watched Ash's fever start to fade, and by the way it looked, he knew Ash was finally, slowly, getting better. Sheila thanked Tanya and Foka for jumping in, and Foka promised to dig through more books and come back if he uncovered anything useful, while Tanya said she was heading home, but told Micah to call her the moment they needed backup. After Volka and Tanya finally left, Sheila nodded and thanked them again, like a weight had just slipped off her shoulders. Micah collapsed down beside her, both relieved and utterly worn out, while Sheila handed over fresh towels and backup bandages just in case. Micah thanked her, and Sheila's kindness landed like a warm light in the middle of all that chaos. Micah urged Sheila to take a break and stop pushing herself, pushed herself to the limit, especially the moment Micah showed up looking completely wiped out. She told Sheila she was okay, then made it crystal clear everything she was doing was for Ash. After that, Sheila leaned back and started reliving the day Ash was born. She remembered a brutal, snowy winter night when David first introduced little Ash to her. She couldn't help but smile as she recalled playing with him, calling him a tiny bundle of unstoppable energy. She said Ash couldn't have picked a better night to be born, and David nodded, laughing that the sun vanished so fast they barely managed to give Ash his first bath in the dark. He said the village chief had come through handing them candles right when they needed them. And Sheila urged, "We'd better thank him again." Once the chance showed up, David asked if Ash had fallen asleep, then he stared at him for a second. He said they had to pick a name for the little guy, or start thinking right now, if it wasn't too soon. And Sheila jumped in, insisting they should decide immediately, because it was the least they could do after he made it safely into the world. David started wondering what name could fit Ash, something that promised healthy growth and real good luck too. And when Sheila pointed out that he'd arrived on a freezing night, she pushed for a name that screamed warmth and light, so he'd never run out of either. David bought the idea instantly, bragging that Sheila always thought this stuff through, and trusting her gut when it came to names. Then Sheila lit up the conversation by suggesting a name tied to the sun or the stars, and David snapped along, saying the sun just felt stronger than the stars. From there, Sheila tossed out more ideas tied to summer and fire, even everyday sparks of warmth, like stoves and candles. While they tossed around these ideas, the realization hit Dawn was already here. So David grabbed the moment, stepped outside, and started setting up breakfast. He said the chef fed him some soup and told Sheila to make sure Ash dug into it the moment he woke up. Then he got busy tending the leftover coals from the day before. Today, alone with her thoughts, Sheila kept replaying Ash's name over and over, like it had a secret in it. And then, little by little, he pointed at Ash like, maybe it's him. When David heard the name, he frowned and asked if it was too plain. Surely she couldn't be serious. Then Sheila admitted it sounded simple, but insisted it had to represent protection and grit, the kind that doesn't break. Sheila told her that since Ash was born in a brutal, no-mercy world, he might not get the same blessings as kids raised in softer seasons, like spring or autumn, because growing up in a remote place meant hardships were waiting around every corner. And to her, the name Ash wasn't random. It was pure endurance, surviving those long, brutal nights and nursing the fire through to morning. That's what she wanted her name to mean. Pure strength to guard those flames all the way to the end. David shot back that a banked fire can't happen without ashes. When Sheila pressed David to spell it out, he just nodded and admitted plainly that Ash was exactly the right name for him. Sheila thanked Micah for listening, then told him she could still see that moment perfectly in her mind. Micah fired back with the tale she once heard from Folka about Ash. She remembered the day Ash vanished into the forest with zero sign he'd ever come back, and panic crushed her from the inside out. Back then, Folka leaned in and told her an ancient legend she'd held onto, because that legend had one thing she couldn't stop talking about. Legend has it there once was an immortal bird god who couldn't truly die. Whenever the bird got hurt or started to age, it would snatch cinnamon branches, spark a magical blaze, and burn itself to the very end. When the flames finally died down, the bird hauled itself up from the ashes reborn, stronger than ever, and healthier than before. Micah said that this legend didn't just sound cool, it perfectly matched the power and grit people expect from the name Ash. She leaned in and told Sheila, just like that bird in the tale, he'll rise again from the ashes renewed, stronger and unbroken. She was sure the Ash would be okay, and if they kept tending his wounds the right way, he'd recover and come through it with no problems. Micah remembered the first aid Ash had taught her, and after everything Tanya and Folka did for her, gratitude hit her like a wave. She tore through the medical books again and again, drilled the instructions with everyone until they stuck, and then patched Asha up exactly the way she'd been taught. No matter how hard she pushed, Ash stayed out cold for days, completely unconscious. Overwhelmed by fear and pure exhaustion, Micah finally crumpled and burst into tears. She admitted she was terrified she'd treated him wrong, and she had no idea what came next. Guilt crushed her because she thought she let him down. If only she'd escaped with Ash sooner, he might have never gotten hurt. Choking on sobs, she apologized to Sheila, guilt clinging to her like a curse. Sheila yanked Micah into a tight hug and poured reassurance into her, insisting none of it was her fault. She praised Micah for her grit and poured out effort caring for Ash, then told her with full confidence that Ash would wake up eventually. Micah then shot a question. How long was Ash going to stay like that? And he couldn't hide the pain in his voice, because there were still so many things she wanted to tell him and share. She confessed, shaking with fear, that she was terrified of losing him and she couldn't bear the thought of him dying. At that exact moment, Ash finally stirred, muttered out an apology, and Shayla and Micah froze in shock, then erupted in pure joy when they realized he'd come back to consciousness. Sheila dashed off right away to call David, while Micah stayed glued to Ash's side. She poured out how terrified she'd been, praying he'd wake up only to stay there motionless, and admitted that a terrifying thought had haunted her, that she might never find her voice with him again. Now that he was finally awake, Micah broke down, again relief and gratitude crashing over her like a tidal wave, tears streaming as she poured out how thankful she was that he'd come back to them. Ash leaned in and told her straight from the heart that he couldn't thank her enough for everything she'd done to help him. When Ash jolted awake, they hit him with ironclad orders. No matter what, he was staying in that room. While the farming season roared at full speed and his worries about his test crops and beekeeping gnawed at him, the order hit him like a punch, hard and heavy. But every voice insisted, shoulder to shoulder, that he obey and stay put. Ash filled Folka in on everything, and Folka shot back. If you stop watching him, he'll snap right back into that usual weird behavior. Ash snapped that they were treating him like a kid, and the villagers just erupted in laughter. Folka slid the book they'd been talking about right into his hands, basically warning that Ash would go crazy with boredom. Otherwise, Ash took it without hesitation and shot back that he'd known Folka would get exactly why he was fed up. Folka agreed, then told Ash he'd have to pay back the loan once he was fully healed, so she urged him to come back later to help decode something. Ash snapped back that he already had enough on his plate, but Folka cut through it fast, telling him a loan is still a loan. While Ash kicked back with the book and tried to recover, he wound up staying at the village chief's house for ages. Whenever he tried to apologize and thank them for the trouble, everyone cut him off by thanking him right back. Yuri even pointed out how wild it was that a giant bear caused barely any damage, then praised Ash for guarding the village. Ash felt Yuri's steady care land in his chest like a debt he couldn't ignore. But somehow, he didn't hate the feeling one bit. As he kept reading, he realized he'd loved this story all along, and the herbal tea recipe section pulled him in like it was made just for him. Ashi realized that if he wanted life in the village to get better, he'd have to tear through almost every practical guide the church had. But even with that decision, he knew pushing progress further was going to be brutally hard. He wanted to level up farming with better fertilizer, but a wall of heavy technical jargon hit him so hard the whole idea just wouldn't click. When he tried to dive deeper into chemistry, he found one brutal truth: every book he cracked gave him vague nonsense, not real answers, and that left him stuck. He had Boka hit up the temple church in the regional capital, hunting for chemistry-related texts, but no matter where they looked, they couldn't dig up a single thing useful. Back then, humanity hadn't even cracked the truth about germs and viruses. Those terrors lived only as foggy whispers in ancient scrolls. Tech progress was all over the place, and Ash got hit with the real kicker: he didn't have the gear to fix it. His wood stove spat out flames that were too weak to control the temperature, and he had zero lab tools that could survive chemical reactions. And there was still no solid way to measure heat, so he was hopelessly unprepared to run chemical experiments, and even making one tiny batch of fertilizer felt like climbing a mountain. Still, boosting food production had to happen. Ash hit a brutal dead end, and the truth landed hard: if he wanted to build anything, he'd have to start hunting down the missing materials and the tools the village didn't have. Yukiya showed up not long after, rushed to Ash's side, and demanded to know how he was feeling. Ash smiled back, greeting her warmly, and thanked her for looking after him. He said he felt well enough to sink back into his reading, and Yukiya let out a huge breath of relief, then hurriedly asked if she could talk to him alone for a minute, and Ash agreed. Yukiya then leaned in and told him her plan: she was going to send Micah to her parents' place in the capital for the winter so she could keep studying. Ash sat there, staring into the moment, realizing proper education mattered more than he'd ever admitted. Yukiya told him Micah could already read, write, and do arithmetic, so he'd be fine even without more lessons in the capital. Then she hit him with the real truth: studying in the city gave him more than just book smarts. Ash nodded, saying building real bonds and learning how the world outside the village works mattered just as much. Yukiya laid out his thoughts and said Micah had skyrocketed in skill because Ash had trained her, and Ash shot back that Micah's growth wasn't magic. It came from her grit and hunger to learn, while he only lit the spark and supported her drive. Yukiya gave Ash a warm nod, then thanked Micah's mother's family with all her heart, because as the village chief's kin, she couldn't help hoping he'd finally accept it. Ash lit up and said he was truly honored by her appreciation, then accepted her thanks on the spot, no hesitation. Relief washed over him. Being noticed and praised by someone he truly respected felt absolutely incredible, even while he chased his own dreams. It felt like a spark to know people out there were truly seeing and valuing everything he was doing. Then Yukiya leaned in and asked, "So can you and the rest stay grateful to me forever?" Ash told her he got what she meant, and once he heard how truly serious she was, he admitted he couldn't just do what he wanted anymore without thinking about the weight his choices would drop on everyone else. So Yukiya smiled and said this change proved she'd won, and Ash finally conceded that, yeah, she totally outplayed him. Ash told himself he never set out to hurt anyone with his reckless moves, but when emotions surged, he would snap into choices without thinking through the fallout. That's when it hit him. Maybe that's exactly why Yukiya decided to appeal to his heart, trying to keep his impulsiveness on a leash before it cost someone everything. Yukiya felt held back by the truth, but it also hit him that he'd probably been even more reckless than he ever admitted. Yukiya. She promised she'd dial down his mood, for now then steered right back to the real point, and said, "I've got a little offer for you." Ash leaned in, totally curious. "What is it?" Yukiya then asked if Ash wanted to go with Micah all the way to the capital, and the second the words landed, Ash's face lit up, practically jumped at the chance. He demanded to know when they'd leave, practically buzzing with excitement, because he'd heard the capital's temple was way bigger than the little church back home, and he was sure it hid a mountain of books. The capital pulsed as a trade hub, pulling in goods from nearby villages and cities so people could tap into a massive mix of materials, knowledge, and tech. Ash practically buzzed with excitement because for the first time, he could finally chase the research that had always been just out of reach. Yukiya snapped that Ash was already sliding back into his old habits, and Ash shot back that it wasn't true then. Quietly admitted he'd been showing a little too much excitement. Yukiya shot back that she'd seen this coming, and already had multiple tricks up her sleeve to get through to him, and even if the royal capital wasn't better at everything, the way it lived, and the world it ran on, was totally different from their village. Ash couldn't stop himself, his excitement kept surging, and he was like, "Why am I still sitting here? I need to run off and start prepping right now." Yukiya just gently told him to slow down. Ash shot off an apology, admitting his excitement got the best of him, then leaned in and asked when they'd finally be leaving. Yukiya told Ash that Micah would be gone all winter, and that he could go with her if he wanted. But before any of that, Ash had to sit down with his parents, hand off his duties to others, and knock out a whole list of prep work first, because Yukiya didn't see them coming back to the village anytime soon. Ash realized that if he left, he'd have to walk away from everything he'd been fighting for: his beekeeping, his personal research, all of it, putting his hard work on pause, and going without seeing the villagers for a long, long time. Right then, Yukiya leaned in and demanded, "So, are you having second thoughts?" Ash realized the village might keep him stuck in the same old life, and the moment he chose the capital to study, everything was about to flip like. This decision could launch him toward a brighter, richer future. He clung to that promise and pushed forward. Then he bravely asked for permission to join him too. Ash nodded and rushed to lock in the preparations Yukiya suggested, itching to tell the villagers he wouldn't be there during winter, and he left behind written instructions so anyone could read them and carry on his duties, and then he even planned to ask who wanted to keep studying while he was gone. And now he had to speed up his work on the test fields and slam together every research result he'd collected so far. The moment he imagined finishing these tasks, adrenaline surged through him because it meant the busiest, biggest stretch of time was about to hit. Yukiya couldn't help but comment, with a hint of worry, that it almost felt wrong how much he was loving juggling all those responsibilities. And he told him to let his wounds heal before pushing any harder. Ash nodded and promised he'd start with jobs he could handle while staying seated. After he finally shook off the recovery, Ash hurried over to Folka to lay it all out. He was heading to the capital, no turning back. He told him that studying there had always been his dream, and that on the village chief's recommendation, he'd be going there, with even the cost of his stay paid for. Folka shot Asher a shocked look when he heard his plan to head for the capital. Ash clocked the reality and admitted he'd be gone for a long, long time. Then he pinned it down. About 2 years. Back then, he'd get rare chances to slip into the village now and then, though the exact plan still wasn't locked in yet. He couldn't hide his excitement. He was thrilled to finally take his time, dive into the city's books, and sharpen his skills. And he even said his injuries were nearly healed while he quietly started organizing his departure. Folka smiled and noticed Ash always darted from one mission straight to the next, which is exactly why the people who cared about him had to keep a hawk eye on him. Ash shot back that because he was Folka's top disciple, Folka should worry about him a bit more, and Folka just chuckled, swatting the whole thing away. He called it pure nonsense, because Ash wasn't the type to throw in the towel that easily. Ash then admitted he'd flirted with death during his illness, and Folka nodded hard, remembering how she'd watched him blaze with that brutal fever and realizing it only proved how unbreakable he was. Folka leaned in and demanded to know what Ash had been thinking as he fought his way through that fever. Ash didn't just talk. He kept screaming it to himself. I'm not dying. And he vowed to live, no matter what came for him. They all chuckled then swore Ash had been mumbling about not dying even in his sleep, and Ash insisted it made perfect sense. When the Grim Reaper finally came for him, it must have gotten the hint and just walked away. As Ash caught himself, he laughed at the thought then admitted the truth. He'd been desperate because there were still so many things he still wanted to get done. Folk snapped him back to reality. There was still work waiting, so he turned his steps straight toward the city. Ash locked in his resolve and Folka slammed the truth into him. Quitting was never, ever an option. Ash nodded and told him to get back to his reading, then promised that if Folka slipped him any letters while he was gone, he'd make sure to answer right away. Folka agreed to write to him, and the moment she said it, he knew he'd have something to do whenever work started freezing him up. Ash cracked a joke like you didn't even need an excuse that ridiculous just to go and write a letter. When Focus got to his feet, he ruffled Ash's hair and told him to give it everything he had. Right as Focus started to head out, Ash snapped, "Where are you going?" Foka grinned and said he was just going for a walk because taking a little time to move now and then does wonders for the body. At that moment, Ash baited Folka, quizzing her why a lifelong shut-in was suddenly heading out and daring her to say what kind of disaster could be pushing her out the door. Folka shrugged off the remark and insisted they pick up the decoding conversation the next time they ran into each other. Ash clenched his resolve to give it everything, then told Folka he hoped the same fire burned in her too.